Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG Show. As you can see, I am in a different location. I am in a hotel room in downtown Victoria with all its vibrancy, not as vibrant as the Hillside Enquirer neighborhood where I was living for just over a month. Hillside Enquirer being the, what's my old joke? That in Hillside Enquirer neighborhood, the crack whores are just friends you haven't made yet. This is only my second broadcast of the week, and I feel I owe you an explanation why. Essentially, I was, chased out of my apartment. The internet was being sabotaged. That is to say, cords were being removed and the internet beacon being hidden on me. I moved into this place, July the 14th, this apartment, with my daughter.
So this is an excerpt from Kevin Michael Grace's latest stream. This is how he began the stream because he was only able to do two shows last week because of this internet sabotage.
And her new husband. And this has been, troublesome from the start. That my daughter had indicated a willingness to share a place with me. And it seems like this has been going on for a year and a half, that she was coming, then she wasn't coming, she was coming, she wasn't coming. Ironically, the reason that she and her husband finally managed to get to Victoria is because of COVID-19. That, of course, COVID-19 is the reason why I represented a deadly medical threat to her, I suppose, because of my age. Okay, let's see. Your connection is unstable. Please wait while we try reconnecting. Okay, well, it seems to be going. Yeah, and the only reason that my daughter and her new husband were able to come to Victoria is because for several months now, the Canadian government has been paying people who are not working, including people who were not working, for months or years before COVID-19 struck. The Canadian government has decided to willfully destroy the economy, but it's going to keep paying people for a little while at least. And where's the money going to come from? Well, they're going to borrow it all. And Canada does not have a money printer go brrr, like the United States, and this is all good. But as I say, this was bad news from the start. That my daughter arrived in Victoria, and they were supposed to be staying at one hotel, and they weren't there, and they were at a different hotel. So the idea was, they had a suite, so the idea was that I was going to move into their suite. They found a place, a permanent place. So a date was set, and they were supposed to come there at 9 o'clock to my hotel. You remember it? That was the big handsome room I was in. And so I confirmed the night before that they were going to be there at 9. And yes. So I called at 8 o'clock just to make sure that everything was ready, and there was no answer. So I left a message, and I left text messages, and by the time it got to, 10:30, checkout time was 11. I was absolutely frantic. And so 11 o'clock passed, and so I had to ask for another day at the hotel, and the kindly clerk who I'd been dealing with for, 7 weeks said, no, you can't have that room for another day. It's taken. And then I really panicked, and she was a very nice woman, and she said, look, you can stay there for another day, and I'll move these people I'll upgrade them into a different room. And so I headed out to the hotel to find them, and it turns out that they were asleep. And so, I don't know, about half an hour later, they're ready to walk to my hotel, and there's no apologies from my daughter The alarm clock was set improperly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The phone was off for some reason. You know the story, right? So anyway, I was out like about $115 there for, what, a 2-hour stay? So we moved to their place, and it's just pandemonium from the start, with screaming arguments, well, mostly bellowed obscenities and threats from her husband, who is a convicted felon, or as we say in Canada, he's been convicted of an indictable offense. And he's a wife beater, and he has beat my daughter up several times, almost to death. He likes to choke her. So eventually a place was found, and it turned out that they could start moving in like 2 days before. And what they did essentially was they moved there and left me alone in the hotel room. I had decided that given how panic-stricken and last minute my last 2 moves had been, I didn't want to go through that again. And the hotel was booked until Saturday morning. And so the idea was that we would move on Friday, and they didn't show up on Friday, and frantic phone messages and texts were ignored. And so eventually a text came in the evening saying, oh no, we're coming around tomorrow morning. And I was absolutely furious because I hadn't done my show that day. I hadn't done my show because I was going to be moving. So they show up. I can't get a hold of them on Saturday morning either. And they show up at 10:45 and they say, you're not packed. Why aren't you packed? And I said, I didn't know you were coming, which was true. And this was blamed on the husband. And my daughter refused to take any responsibility. You're seeing a pattern here. But so we move into the place, and there's, again, it's just pandemonium, with just both of them getting drunk every night, smoking high THC dope, and these ferocious fights breaking out. And I hadn't been sleeping properly for weeks because of being woken up at all hours of the late evening or early morning because of this. And on Sunday evening, Monday morning, there was another physical attack, which left my daughter with a black eye and a big scratch on her nose and 2 large bruises on her neck where she'd been choked. She told me that the only reason that he hadn't killed her is because his mother, who he had invited along with 2 other people into the apartment without asking me, had walked into the room while the attack was going on. And my daughter fled, and she didn't have keys, so she was locked out, and she had to go to a bed and breakfast. And I finally, it took me pretty much a whole day to run her down. And she was saying she didn't want to come back, okay. But then eventually she did at 11 o'clock, and she and I barricaded the door. I went to bed about 2 o'clock in the morning, and the husband shows up, and of course she lets him in. And when was it? Was it on Wednesday morning? I was awoken by bellowed obscenities, and my daughter shrieking in terror just after 1 o'clock in the morning, just after 3 o'clock in the morning. And I thought, okay, this is it. This is it. I wondered about going to the police beforehand, and then I decided that, yeah. I walked to the police headquarters on, when was this? I guess it must have been Wednesday, yeah. And I talked to a police officer, and he didn't really tell me much that was of much use. And then later in the day, I found out that the internet had been sabotaged again, and I thought, okay, this is it. This is the end. So I called the police. 2 police cars came, 3 cops, and they took my keys, and they went up. I explained everything that had gone on. And they went up to the apartment, and they interviewed them, and they came back downstairs. Of it. That's actually what they told me. And then they said, this is a volatile situation, and you have to leave. What? Yes, you have to leave immediately. But, I wanted to help my daughter with affinities, so I guess that's what we see in this case. In any event, I won't be making that mistake again, and I don't think I'm going to be having anything. But when I disappeared from, crack central for Victoria, it's also close, I'm told, to the hooker stroll. If you're listening to my stream in the last few weeks, you will have heard the wail of almost unending wail of ambulances and police sirens, because it's just that vibrant. But it turns out that the whole of Douglas Street is pretty much Douglas is Edmonton's main drag, and it's pretty vibrant. And something happened today directly across the street from where I'm staying, not across the thoroughfare, but like the side street, so I could look out my window and watch it. That I noticed this morning that there were 3 cop cars, or 2 cop cars, and a cop truck of some kind, and their lights were flashing, and there were all these policemen in the parking lot of Paul's Motor Inn, which has a distinctive copper-colored roof. It's a Victoria landmark for decades. In fact, the fellow who owned it was a client of Doug Christie, who I used to work for, and he owns other properties, including a luxury hotel in James Bay, where I once stayed after I won some sort of award. But I find out, well, here's the story from CTV News. Man arrested after tense standoff at Victoria homeless shelter. One man has been arrested following heavily armed officers with the Victoria Police Department Greater Victoria Emergency Response Team descended on the scene of the former Paul's Motor.
Okay, so that's the latest from Kevin Michael Grace's latest show. What a nightmare situation. Wow. And I've been in situations that are similar to that. So I'll just share some of my own nightmare living situations. At least on the good side, Kevin Michael Grace is up to 1,000 subscribers. So he is eligible to apply for monetization. So I hope he can monetize his YouTube channel and put these problems behind him. So when I came down with chronic fatigue syndrome in my 20s, I was forced back to living with my parents. And then I went back to Australia for 8 months to live with my sister at first and then my brother. And so I was relying on family. And this had happened before. I'd bollocksed up my life or screwed up my life in various ways before and fallen back on the help and support of my family. And yet when this happened, I had some gratitude, but I also had like a ton of resentment. I felt like, oh, my parts of my family just didn't understand me, that I'm stuck in some kind of really sick matrix. And as the years went by and I was living with my parents in Northern California, it wasn't an ideal situation for me or for them, right? Have a kid who's 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, and essentially bedridden and no hope in sight. Not easy for them, not easy for me. So I think about age 25, 26, I realized I desperately needed community. I desperately needed friends. I needed to get out of the situation I was in. I felt like if I remained in the situation I was in, I would never get well. Because we got our water through a ditch, right? The water would flow through a ditch, and then it would be treated in a treatment tank that we had. But for about a month, our treatment tank wasn't working. This was right before I got sick. So my father and mother didn't get sick, and they were drinking the same water. But anyway, I just felt I'll never get well here. And so I just started desperately placing all these singles ads and responding to singles ads. I was going for quantity, not quality. And that may be reminiscent of my live streams. Of my approach to life is to go for quantity, not quality. So my streams may not be very good, but at least they are long. And Glib Medley notes, these are the same relatives of Kevin's who screwed him over in Edmonton a few winters ago. I believe so. And Glib had a very funny remark the other day that Kevin Michael Grace would be a good protagonist in a Michelle Houellebecq novel, but he'd need to engage in degenerate, meaningless sexual encounters. So I was just desperately like reaching out to people right and left. And then this like small trickle of women were driving up to see me. And that would brighten my day to no end. And I met one woman in Orlando, Florida, and she started calling me every day. And she'd been quite ill herself. She'd even attempted suicide. She was chronically ill. And she said, oh, you got to meet my psychiatrist. I got to introduce you to my psychiatrist, the late Dr. Daniel Gorwin. And eventually I started to hook up with these women who'd come to visit me. And then I decided to move to Orlando, Florida, because one of the women that I had hooked up with, she sent my parents this really angry letter telling them about all the places in their house where we'd had sex. And my father was outraged. For conservative Christians, the greatest sins are sexual. And so I had used their home, had taken advantage of their home to commit these horrible sins. And so this was like a complete outrage. And I was written out of the will. It caused my parents great pain to think that their son was somebody who used women. So I alienated myself from my parents. I fled to Florida with this woman. And she didn't find me any great treat. I had promised to cook, and I didn't end up doing any of the cooking. And she found me overly needy. she found me quite the disappointment. So she started going off to see her ex-boyfriend, and then I would throw a fit, and not a good situation all around. And she'd noticed that whenever I was feeling particularly outraged, that my chest would flush red. Whenever I felt like people were talking down to me, my chest would flush red. She noticed how much I enjoyed luxury, that I took her luxury chair in the living room, just made myself at home there, and I would donate money to Dennis Prager's Micah Center for Ethical Monotheism, rather than giving her money to maintain the home where we lived. So she didn't find me any great treat. And the psychiatrist she took me to said, I really think you ought to try this medication, Nardil, Nardil, but it would require going off the medication that I was on. So I went off the medication that I was on, and feeling quite low. And the woman I'm living with, she's now spending the night with her ex-boyfriend. And so I'm furious and upset, and I pack all my stuff. And I go to synagogue on Saturday morning, and I'm just crying for hours. I'm sitting there in the pews, and I'm just crying and crying. So the rabbi meets with me after synagogue, and he arranges for me to stay with this family that lives just across the street. This highly eccentric family that when this other couple had stayed with them just for the Sabbath, they were so afraid of this eccentric family that they stayed up all night, scared that the host family would kill them. So I move in there, and I finally get on Nardil, and my life starts to improve. But there's a 14-year-old boy who's also there, who lives there, and I get into an argument with him, and I end up like putting him in a headlock. And he doesn't appreciate that, so he goes to the kitchen and grabs this big knife and starts like waving it at me. And so I like run out the door to the synagogue across the street and call the police. And the police come, and they say, well, we can't press any charges because you apparently initiated this by putting this kid in a headlock. And then the kid's mother did not appreciate this. She said, why didn't you call me instead of the police? And so about this time, Dennis Prager said, if you move to Los Angeles, I might have a job for you. And so I thought, let me go to Los Angeles. Let me make a fresh start on things. So when I was listening to Kevin tell his story, I was thinking, wow, that reminds me of adventures in my life, but at least I've never had the police called or had to call the police. And then I thought, wait, that's not true. I did call the police. How embarrassing. Like we don't tend to remember those things in our lives that we don't want to remember. And so I started weekly therapy in 1998. We do 2 back-to-back sessions, I think, every Friday morning. And I had this therapist on and off for about a decade. And she told me, like 8 years into our therapy, she said, when I was working with you for those first 3 years, we didn't really get to do much depth work because crisis to crisis. I always felt like I was trying to help you manage your latest crisis. And she also confided that I thought you were heading in a direction to be a sociopath. So my own therapist was afraid I was going to become a sociopath. She thought that I was so desperate and needy that she felt like she just wanted to take me home and give me a room to stay in her home. I moved to Los Angeles in 1994. The job with Dennis Prager didn't work out, but I was staying with a faculty member at UCLA. And then one evening he comes padding into my room and asks me if I want a blowjob. It's like, oh, no. So that relationship kind of splintered, and I lived out of my car for most of the next 8 months. And sometimes I'd have to iron my shirts on the benches at, say, the Beverly Hills Park. And there were 3 weeks there where I didn't get to take a shower. So I'd wash my hair in the Beverly Hills Park bathroom. And I remember when I'd get sick and I have a high temperature and I'm just living out of my car. It's just the height of misery. And then my car broke down. And so I just broke it up with my girlfriend, who I'd been staying with. And so my car's broken down, and I know that she's got a date this night, and I'm supposed to stay with a friend who later hit the tabloids. I'm trying to remember why he was in the tabloids, but I was supposed to stay with him, but he hadn't come home by midnight, so I knew that my girlfriend had been on a date. So I went and stood outside her apartment, waiting for the lights to go out, hoping that meant that she was alone. And yeah, this is 1994, before I directed my one porn movie. And so when the lights went out, I then like rang the buzzer and told her I was in a bit of a bad situation and could I possibly stay with her. She was not happy, but luckily she was alone. She allowed me to stay on the couch, and she ended up lending me $500. And I did repay her about 3 months later. Shortly thereafter, I went to Manhattan for 3 weeks, my only time staying in New York City. This heiress, I'd met her through a singles ad. So she paid for my flight to Manhattan. She gave me spending money. She lent me money as well. She lent me something like $500 or $700 because I wanted to see this manager who gave like a 2-hour consultation for $500. So I went and met with this manager, and I told him I'd been booked on this movie. I was very excited. It had been announced in Variety, so I was going to have one of the leading roles in this movie. And he did a little research and found out that the movie was just a scam. So, yeah, I'm quite familiar with these disasters, just one disaster leading into another, into another, into another. I mean, chaos. That was my life. And so I'm not at such a spiritual level where if I was going through what Kevin Michael Grace is going through, that I could have equanimity. I would not be feeling like, oh, I'm just walking with the Lord. You know, I'm close with Hashem, that everything's going to be okay. I have faith in God, and I know that God runs the universe, and so therefore I am at ease and at peace. And I can't pretend that I would be at ease or at peace, or that I'd have strong faith if I was going through anything akin to what Kevin Michael Grace is going through. So, thank God, my life is much more stable. The last 5 years, I've been free of that like nagging inner voice that my life's not on the right track. Like, I hate that nagging inner voice. So you can't even walk down the street and enjoy the sunshine. You can't be alone and be at peace. You can't be with other people and be at peace. You can't be with community and be at peace. You can't even use pornography and be at peace. So I was walking down the street today with my SLA book. It's a completely anonymous looking book, but it's the textbook for the 12-step program, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. And I just read a few sentences and walk and think about them, and then read a few more sentences. This really spoke to me from its guide to step 1. Yet a vague but persistent nagging within our deepest self continued to bear witness that all was not well. And that so spoke to me because throughout my life, until really the last 5 years, I've had these vague but persistent naggings that kind of speak to me that something's not quite right. Despite all the cultural and rational camouflage behind which our addiction could hide, it was impossible, short of suicide, to kill that innermost voice that whispered to us of life's opportunities for growth and wholeness that we were helplessly letting slip by. So in my 20s, it felt like I was approximately even with my peers once I got back into life after age 27. And in my 30s, it didn't seem like they were that far ahead of me. But by my 40s, the gap between me and my peers was dramatic. They were all married, they had kids, they had mortgages, they were established in their professions. And they were usually respected in the community, and I was not really any of those things. So the guilt of prior deeds and passions or missed opportunities gave way to the deepest, most pervasive guilt of all, that of having left life unlived, having turned our backs on the possibility of fulfilling a meaningful destiny. Yeah, that's perhaps the most persistent nagging doubt that I've had over the course of my life, that I've left life unlived by getting so caught up in my obsessions that the chance for normality, the chance for family, kids, a respectable position in society, I'd sacrificed all that to essentially go join the circus of following my obsessions. These existential pangs were not welcomed into our awareness. Yeah, I did not enjoy feeling ill at ease, yet they found their way in whatever we did. The heat of addictive passion was less and less able to blot them out. So I'd pursue love, I'd pursue sex, I'd pursue fame, but none of those things were able to staunch and silence this unwelcome inner voice, the still small voice of God telling me that my life was not on track. It's an awful feeling, like when you're going more into debt with each week. Like it's a terrible feeling, or just that your life is heading in the wrong direction. That's what I felt between 1995 and 2007 when I was writing on the porn industry. I felt like my life was headed in the wrong direction. The guilt of prior deeds and passions or missed opportunities. The addiction itself, my sex and love addiction or porn addiction. When I was writing on the porn industry, I didn't have any porn addiction, thank God, because I was so close to the nastiness that was going on all around me that porn didn't hold the charge, didn't hold an allure for me. It was only when I was out of the porn industry that my yen for porn would come back. I was mixing with the people who made porn. I was just, I had no desire to consume its product. The addiction itself could no longer deliver that formerly reliable, thoroughly engrossing sexual and emotional return. The utter futility of going on under the sway of our sex and love addiction was finally becoming clear. So yeah, when I'd get a new sex partner or get into a new relationship, then it would temporarily seem like my problems had gone away, because I'd just get obsessed with this woman that I was with. But then I'd put way too much weight on the relationship. The relationship would not be able to handle it, and it would collapse. It mattered little whether our patterns were primarily those of unbridled promiscuity. So my first 2 years in Los Angeles, really my first year, I slept with something like 20 women. And then after that, I settled down into, what's it called, provisional monogamy, just keeping the sex within the context of a relationship. Serial monogamy, that's what I settled down into. So was it unbridled promiscuity or excessive emotional dependency on one person? Yeah, when I'd meet a woman who I felt like, oh, she fulfills me. She's the missing part to the hole in my soul. And then I'd become overly attached. Is Luke okay with the notion that he may never experience the loving embrace of a woman for the rest of his life, God forbid? Yeah, I am okay. I would not like that. But I'm a pretty happy guy, even though I'm currently not experiencing the loving embrace of a woman. So it's a little more challenging these days because I'm rarely attracted to women over the age of 40. And so women under 40 don't tend to be terribly interested in 54-year-old me. Each of us finally experiences a sense of real desperation to continue to live out our addictive patterns or to be controlled by them, brought us in touch with the terror of irrevocably losing sanity. So yeah, there were times I was afraid I was going to lose my sanity, slipping over the edge of an abyss beyond which any stability and life purpose would be forever out of reach. So I was often really good at meeting people, but then once they got to know me, they realized what a wreck my life was. So I'd meet people, not just romantic or possible sexual partners, but just like regular people who I'd hit it off with and want to become friends with. But then my inner weirdness would come out and they'd just distance themselves because I was just way off kilter. And so I'd meet great people and think, I'm making friends, I'm building community. And then I'd find ways to blow these things up. We found this prospect of losing our sanity more terrifying than the thought of physical death. Yet for a few of us, the terror of being further devoured by our sex and love addiction brought us to the point of unconditional surrender. We decided we had to stop. Now we began to confront the second aspect of powerlessness, the paradox that surrender to the impossibility of control is the beginning of recovery. So I have not had these nagging doubts the last 5 years. So about 3.5 years ago, I managed to double, triple my income. So I was tickling 6 figures and it was sustainable. and I was steadily paying off my debts, and I was finally feeling at ease in the world. Like I was just able to walk down the street without nagging doubts, without anxiety. I was able to be on my own and read books without nagging doubts and anxiety. I was able to be with other people and with community without nagging doubts and anxiety. I was able to pay my own way. I was able to meet my adult responsibilities. I was able to feel like a man. And COVID has hit, and I get to make much of my living online. I'm teaching online Alexander Technique lessons. So Alexander Technique is a method for noticing how we respond to stimuli and letting go of those responses that don't serve us. So it has immediate application for things like neck pain, back pain, shoulder pain, and also allows us to have a higher level of performance with regard to speech, with regard to movement, with regard to thinking, because how we are in our body is going to affect our thinking. Our thinking is going to affect our body, and both our thinking and body are going to affect our emotions, which in turn will affect our thinking and our body. So learning to be at ease with our body, with our soul, with our thinking, with our emotions, that's such a wonderful, wonderful place to be. So COVID-19 hits, and many Alexander Technique teachers, their livelihood is wiped out because people aren't coming in for in-person lessons. So I've been able to switch my Alexander lessons to online. So I dominantly teach the technique online, and that's a good source of income that I can just do from the security of my own home or wherever I might be, and work with people, try to inculcate the certain principles of movement and of how the body works across Skype, across FaceTime. Heard Luke almost fell in love a few times, but then he'd get them in a headlock. Luke lives long enough, there'll be a loving sex robot indistinguishable from a real woman, other than the robots being too perfect. So it's nice. Things like the lockdown hit and the pandemic hits, and you've got at least 6 months of savings. All right. I'm at ease. I've got savings. I've got ways of earning money online. I don't need to leave the house to make money. Or, on the other hand, I can leave. I can move anywhere I go.
About non-Jews. Pikuach Nefesh is because we actually have Jews there too, so that's kind of almost like an overlay to the importance of making sure that you are there to serve the military. So how far down can you go? At my level, there wasn't a question. Assistant secretaries, which is the next level down, in many cases can make critical decisions. Very often they'll report directly to the Secretary of Defense, and sometimes even to the President. The next level down, and my second son already had this position, is Deputy Assistant Secretary. That's actually the highest level of the day-to-day work of the department, and tends not to be a policy level, but sometimes that is too. So it becomes a function not just of the rank, it becomes a function of the responsibility. If your responsibility is such that a decision that you make could affect the lives of the military, maybe because you weren't there to support getting a weapon out in the field, or some other reason, then Shabbos and Yontif just don't come in. And I can give you an example of that. You might think, well, the bureaucracy is so slow moving and it doesn't make a difference. One day in November of 2001, a month or so after we had decided we were going to go after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, the Assistant Secretary for Research comes to see me, and he says, I've got a weapon system that's basically been sitting there for years. We think it's been developed, but the system, the bureaucracy simply doesn't bring it out into the field. And this weapon system, it's called a hyperbaric weapon. If you fire it into a cave, it catches the air and it'll blow everything out of the cave. And he needed, I don't know, 80 million or whatever it was, which when your budget is 450 billion, 80 million is a rounding error. So I said, look, when can you get this out there? He said, you get me the money, I can get it out there in a few months. So I got him the money, and he got it out there in a few months. Now, every day, and by the way, it worked, and it blew all these Al Qaeda people hiding in caves. Just it decimated them because it was a fireball, and it went right through the caves. Well, if you delay by a day, and the weapon is a day later, and somebody dies the day before, well, that's the price of delay. So pikuach nefesh comes down to, do you have any kind of responsibility that might cause that delay, or on the other hand, accelerate something that will allow people to live? One of the great tragedies of any war is the last person to die in that war. And it happens. War of 1812, we fought the Battle of New Orleans. They'd actually made peace, but nobody knew that. So people were dying in the battle when peace had already been made. So clearly a decision, time is of the essence with these sorts of decisions. I might say something about anti-Semitism. The truth is, I never really encountered it. Maybe I've been fortunate. It came up in a veiled way once when a general made a remark about pork. It's the only time that I served in the government that's the closest it ever came. Now, outside the government, different story. I've encountered it, as many other people have. But in the military, it just didn't happen. And I think one of the reasons, although, clearly there are anti-Semites in the military. There have been cases, especially troubles in the Air Force Academy, which is interesting because the current head of the Air Force, although he's a convert, he was born a Jew, his name's General Goldfein, and he does care about these things. But nevertheless, by and large, the military doesn't do that, and there's a very simple reason.
Okay, I've spoken a little bit about Mia Khalifa, former porn star, not very happy with the porn industry. Let me play
through this step by step. How did a girl who was brought by her parents to the United States from Lebanon, your home country, schooled in the United States, clearly smart, went to university in Texas, read history. How did you get involved with the sex porn industry?
I don't think low self-esteem discriminates against anyone. It doesn't matter if you come from a great family or if you come from a not so great background. I struggled my entire childhood with weight, and I never felt attractive or worthy of male attention. And suddenly, my first year of college, I started losing all this weight from making small changes. And by the time I graduated, I was ready to make a bigger difference. I felt extremely self-conscious about my breasts because that was the first thing to go when I lost all the weight. I lost about 50 pounds. I don't know how many kilos that is, or stones.
Well, it's a considerable amount of weight.
Yeah,
It changed your body, changed you physically.
Completely.
Yeah.
So my biggest insecurity was my breasts. So I wanted to more or less go back to what they normally were. And once I did that, I started garnering all of this attention from men, and I was never used to it. And I felt like unless I held on to it and kind of did what was asked of me or what was expected of me, it would go away. And after feeling what it was like, that validation and the compliments for the first time, I did not want that to go away.
You were spotted, I think, on a street. I mean, there you were a young graduate wanting to sort of find a job, and you were spotted on a street by a guy who said, I can work with you, and clearly he opened up and said, it's the porn business. What was it in you that far from running away, was drawn into it?
It wasn't. That's not how it was. It wasn't just, hey, do you want to come do porn? It was more so, oh, you're beautiful. Like, would you like to do some modeling? Oh, you have a great body. Like, I think you'd be great in nude modeling. Things like that. And after I came in toward the studio, it was very respectable. It was a gorgeous location. It was in Miami, in Doral, Florida. It was clean. Everyone who worked there was nice. All of their cubicles were decorated with family photos. Like, it was nothing.
And there's a great principle here that if you sell yourself short, if you allow other people to take advantage of you, there are no end of people who will line up to take advantage of you. So it is incumbent upon the individual to develop the clarity and the boundaries that enable one to sidestep being screwed over.
Dodgy, or that made me uncomfortable. And after, the first time I went in wasn't the first time I filmed a porn movie. It was the second time. The first time was more so, do you want to do this? Like, sign the paperwork, et cetera, et cetera.
So these guys, they just saw you, frankly, as a money machine.
Absolutely.
But you still had no advisors, you had no lawyer, you had no nothing. So
what 21-year-old has a lawyer on retainer?
I'm just trying to get my head around how stressful this must have been, and whether even now, because you sit here so poised, and obviously a lot of time has passed and you've moved on, but do you think there is some sort of post-traumatic stress that is in you from this experience?
Yes, and I think it kicks in mostly when I go out in public, because the stares I get, I feel like people can see through my clothes, and it brings me deep shame. It makes me feel like I lost all right to my privacy, which I did, because I'm one Google search away.
Yeah, and those images you cannot expunge. No. You have no right, even though it is deeply personal to you, you have no right to remove them from anybody's view around the world.
Yeah.
It is very hard.
It is.
And I'm just thinking, this isn't, I mean, the story is your story, but frankly, it's also the story of other porn actors and actresses.
I honestly started seeing that recently after the interview came out, and people started reaching out, and all of the emails go, my manager checks them. And when he gets stuff like that, he filters them and sends them to me. And reading the words of some of these girls who have been sex trafficked and forced into porn, and all of these stories of girls whose lives have been ruined by it, and by men who have taken advantage of them, and by contracts that they didn't even understand the jargon of, it makes me feel like, okay, maybe it was good that I started talking and that I posted this interview. And
so she's still milking her body today on her own YouTube channel, on her own social media feeds. She's still accentuating her breasts. She's doing videos about her breast surgeries. She's doing this YouTube video where she's, her mouth is filled with toothpaste to try to make it look like she's swallowing the essence of man. So she's still working it. She's not quite the innocent angel.
And that I'm speaking out now because other people feel the same way. And even if they don't relate on as deep a level as, doing porn, they can relate on the level of being insecure and being pressured into doing something they didn't want to do.
You were wearing the Islamic headscarf, often known as hijab, and of course then it developed into a sort of a sex scene. You must have known how provocative that was.
I verbatim told them, you guys are going to get me killed.
And they said?
They just laughed.
Why didn't you then say, I'm not doing it?
Intimidation. I was scared.
But
I knew that if I said no, it would, they're not going to force you to do it. At that point, that's rape. No one's going to force you to have sex. But I was still scared. I mean, have you ever felt scared not scared, but nervous to speak up and say something at a restaurant when your food's not right and the waiter comes by and says, how is everything? I was.
Okay, so Bang Bros has responded. They say that Mia makes many false statements, many innuendos and accusations. We have tried to stay silent, allow Mia to have a publicity stunt without responding. Mia has taken our silence as an all clear to not only continue, but to ramp up her false statements. We therefore have no choice but to respond to the most glaring, objectively false statements. The following are the facts over Mia's fiction. So for one thing, if her porn experience was this traumatizing, why does she still use her porn name? Why is that how she wants to be known, by her porn name? You'd think if it was so bad that she would switch back to her birth name or some other name.
you were paid a grand total for all the 12 sex videos you made. You were paid a grand total of $12,000 US.
I was like on the books on payroll, not just as a porn actress, maintaining my online persona because it was financially beneficial to me. And I haven't done porn for 5 years.
She is probably the biggest known name in the entire porn industry, and yet she only did porn for 3 months.
You guys are fun. I love coming here. Of course I have energy. You guys make me happy. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm very proud of it. Thank you.
And yet she only did porn for 3 months.
I actually got into porn when I was leaving work. I was confronted by editors at Scoreland. And asked if I would consider working for them, doing a scene for them, and I thought about it, and I figured it would be fun, so I tried it. And then after I did 2 scenes with them, I came to Bang Bros, and they put me on contract.
He got out of his car, he handed me a business card. He was a marketing executive.
I was confronted by editors at Scoreland.
He was a marketing executive.
They're all like my inner fantasies that Bang Bros pays to let me act out. I love it.
How much personal responsibility do you feel you have to take for what you did?
100%. at the end of the day, it was my choice. Biggest thing standing in my way is myself.
Yeah.
Not anybody else.
You were paid a grand total for all the 12 sex videos.
Okay, so she's repeatedly stated she only made $12,000 in the adult industry. Mia received in excess of $178,000 from Bang Bros alone, and we have no idea how much she made with the other 3 adult brands that she performed with before she performed for Bang Bros. She's repeatedly stated she was only in the adult industry for 3 months. It was more like 3 years. She claims that she repeatedly told the producers, "You guys are going to get me killed." The statement never happened. Mia Khalifa had a lot of creative control over the ideas for the site. She was fully behind each one. But don't just take our word for it. Take hers.
It'll have all of my scenes will be on there. My scenes from now on will be on there. I'm running the whole thing. I write everything on it. All the descriptions are me. All the scenes are my idea. It's basically like my dump site for all of my dirty, dirty fantasies, and Bang Bros is letting me do all of them. Like, I come to them with my fantasy and my, I guess, alter ego. I get to, like, live them out and document them and put them on the site. I love Bang Bros! And of course, you know I'm a Bang Bros girl for life. And it's all coming from me and my inner fantasies. I help create every scene. I write all of the descriptions for it. Anything you see written on the site, I wrote it myself. Obviously, the Bang Bros producers do an amazing job, but it's a collaboratory effect.
Okay, Mia's recently claimed that 6 years later that she was manipulated into signing her Bang Bros contract. She was never manipulated. She renewed her contract for more years. She negotiated different terms into it. She was quite excited to be on the contract, as you can see here.
6 to 10 scenes. You guys, I'm on contract with Bang Bros now for 6 months. I'm only shooting with Bang Bros. 1 scene a week. Thank you! Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm very proud of it. Thank you. Thank you. So I shot a scene with them, and then they offered me a contract. And it was, I don't really like talking about it, but it was a deal I couldn't refuse, and also I was very honored because they haven't had a contract girl since Brandy Bell. 6 to 10.
Okay, she says that she owns the trademark to Mia Khalifa, but Mia Khalifa is a porn name that was registered by Bang Bros, and she was paid to assign Bang Bros the exclusive right to her stage name. And again, Mia Khalifa is a porn stage name that she insists on continuing to use, while at the same time denouncing why she's famous for the name Mia Khalifa. Mia has claimed that Bang Bros and others are intentionally pushing her content in response to her recent statement. Now, it's more like the Streisand effect. When she talks about her porn content, people are going to start looking for her poor content. You can see in the Google Trends graph below. Mia Khalifa, struggling to stay relevant over the years, needs to attack Bang Bros and the porn industry to stay relevant. If we were cynical, we might think that the reason she wants this press and her prior content removed is because it will make her adult photo business more valuable, or while using the popularity and name recognition from her video content. We're sure she'd never do anything that calculated, though. So a different perspective there on Mia Khalifa.
It'll have all of my scenes will be on there. My scenes from now on will be on there. I'm running the whole thing. I write everything on it. All the descriptions are me. All the scenes are my idea. It's basically like my dump site for all of my dirty, dirty.
Okay.
You know, everybody has to. You cannot fight on your own when you're in the military. You have to depend on other people. Whether you can be the biggest racist in the world, but you're gonna have to depend on the black fellow who's a private right next to you and might save your life, or might carry you from the field if you're wounded. And the same with Jews, and the same with Muslims. It's the ultimate nowadays, the ultimate melting pot, because people have to look after each other. The Marines always say, no Marine left behind. Well, who's going to be the one that picks you up so that you're not left behind? You don't know. So you don't take chances by venting whatever private hatreds you might have. And so I was very fortunate that way. By the way, the article that I wrote, which you could read, I've discovered, sometimes I've handed the article to people going into government. For instance, Elliot Cohen, Professor Elliot Cohen was Condi Rice's, for a while, counselor at the State Department, which is a very, very prominent job. I gave him that article. Interesting story about him. His son, who went to the Hebrew Academy here in Washington, Rafi, nice Jewish boy, always used to play with toy soldiers. He goes to Harvard and he joins, I don't know if he went to ROTC or officers training, but he joins the Army. This nice Jewish kid finished first in Ranger class. He gets sent out to Iraq, and he's put in charge of a unit that's supposed to disarm IEDs, improvised explosive devices, the things that were blowing up our people and our tanks and our armored vehicles. So you can imagine what it's like having to disarm those things. He had all kinds of experiences in Iraq. When his father, Elliot, was sworn in as counselor to the State Department, Rafi showed up in uniform, because he was still in the military, with his decorations and his yarmulke. There's something to be said. This country is going through tsuris now, like as bad as when I was a youngster in '68. But there's something about this country. And it's not every country that has chiefs of staff who are Jewish. It's not every country that has, today there was an obituary in the New York Times of Rabbi Lamb. It pointed out that, Joe Lieberman, Senator Lieberman, ran for vice president as an Orthodox Jew. Jack Lew was Secretary of the Treasury as an Orthodox Jew. In fact, Joe Lieberman made my life easy, because when I would travel to go out to the military.
So you may not want to live in a multicultural, multiracial society, but as long as you do, you need to be careful about the things that you say about other groups and other races, because it's not quite as extreme as the U.S. military or the Marines, where you depend upon other people for your life. But there are plenty of times when you may well depend upon other people for your life, at least for your well-being. So you may well prefer a homogeneous society, but as long as you're living in a multiracial, multicultural society, you need to watch what you say, or other people may well retaliate, and you may not enjoy the retaliation. So we all have our own beliefs, we all have our own preferences, but then reality should have a considerable say in how much we express them, how publicly we express them, how crudely we express them. Because if you're living in a multiracial society, you need to probably avoid slurring other groups. You need to avoid pouring hatred on other groups, because it's just not functional in a multiracial, multicultural society to do that, unless somehow you've developed a particularly impregnable way of life where other people's opinions just are not going to matter to you. So I think the Army and the Marines, that's two particularly graphic demonstrations of how we rely upon other people. But even if you're not in the armed forces, we still rely on other people. We essentially depend upon the tolerance of the people we live around and work around to enjoy our lives. And so the wise person avoids saying and doing things that will try that tolerance. The wise person avoids infuriating people unnecessarily, so that they are given incentives to band together to drive you out. Because if the people around you are sufficiently incentivized to loathe you and to drive you out, they can make your life absolutely miserable, if not impossible. So facts on the ground get a say. Reality gets a say in how you live, in how you speak, in how you operate, right? Every society has basic truths whereby if you say them out loud, you'll get stigmatized and punished, right? So you may think we're living in unprecedented times, and sure, you can tote up reasons for why 2020 is absolutely unprecedented, but it also has many parallels. And one of the parallels with past societies and past times is that there are always fundamental truths about life that you can't say out loud without experiencing severe blowback.
I would simply tell them, look, treat me the way you treat Senator Lieberman. Lieberman was a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And, when anybody in the Senate Armed Services Committee says jump, the Pentagon says, how high do you want me to go? So they all knew what Joe had, could do and couldn't do. And so I would say, just treat me like Senator Lieberman. Yes, Mr. Secretary. It was very, very easy. But the fact is that that's what this country's been about. That an Orthodox, it's not just that an Orthodox Jew can be part of society, can be the lawyer in a law firm or an accountant in a fancy accounting firm or whatever. It's that you can be a leader of this country, a leader of the military. That's very, very special. So I'm hoping, we should all hope, that the troubles that we're going through as I speak, whether it's economic, whether it's health-wise, whether it's the racial troubles we're having, that it'll pass. I mean, it actually, the riots have affected.
Okay, looking at the chat right now, Glib says, but if one is of certain minorities, he can get away with saying nastier things about the majority group. Yeah, that's part of reality, is that certain groups are graded on a curve. It's not only whites who face blowback. You're having black entertainers who've been fired, who've been dropped by their managers. So black entertainers who've spoken out against whites and against Jews have been fired for their anti-Jewish comments. But that's also part of reality, that you need to know how much you can get away with. Also, the more prestigious your position, the less you can get away with. So professor is much more prestigious than a guy working in construction. So as a professor, you can get away with less political incorrectness than, say, a guy working in construction. A doctor has a prestigious position. He can get away with less political incorrectness publicly expressed than, say, the janitors at his hospital. So you have to know where you are in the social pecking order, and you have to know how much you can get away with. And the challenge is to play tennis with the net up. Right? Anyone can play tennis with the net down. Anyone can write poetry that doesn't rhyme, that doesn't scan. As an eBay seller, generally speaking, you don't have to worry about political incorrectness. You can pretty much say anything, and as long as it's not directly linked to your eBay account, you should be okay.
Affected my family because my son heads the Ronald Reagan Institute, and they just built a new building right near the White House, and the walls, most of which were made of glass, have been shattered. The doors have been shattered. The rioters have been rioting. So let's hope that it all passes. But the fact of the matter is that we have, not just at the highest levels, but at many levels, Orthodox Jews who are in the national security community, and who therefore need to know what they can do and what they can't do. And basically, the bottom line is, if it's a derabanan, it's a rabbinical ordinance. If that's the case.
So you need to know who you can talk to openly and who you can't. For example, I was talking to a prospective Alexander Technique client, and he wanted to know how I'm different from other Alexander Technique teachers, and I said I'm Australian. So I say things in a more blunt manner. I'm not like a Yank who's going to tippy-toe around possibly offending you. I'm going to be very blunt, and I'm going to challenge you, and I'm not going to be supportive. And I've said the same things to other clients. So if you establish certain things up front within a certain context, then that sort of sets the parameters by which you can safely operate.
And you're dealing as a government official, and that's very, very key, not as a consultant, not as an advisor. You have to be the government official. You have to be what's called malchus. If you are, then you have all sorts of heterim. Torah laws are a different issue, but rabbinical laws are certainly the case. And I'll finish so that if somebody wants.
And heterim means a heter is permission. So one of the famous sayings in Orthodox Jewish life is, I have a heter from a major league Rav. That means I have permission to do what I'm doing from a big rabbi. So don't give me surahs, don't give me a hard time. So on the one hand, Orthodox Judaism looks formidably difficult with all these laws. On the other hand, it's an almost infinitely flexible approach to life that enables you to navigate reality.
Wants to ask me a question or two in the remaining few minutes. I'll finish with the fact that there's a gentleman in my community who is a senior, very firm guy, senior official in the department right now. And when he first went in, or when I saw him, told him about my article. I gave him a copy. And a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to him. We were walking down the street, which is about all you can do right now. And we saw him, my wife and I, and we saw him and his wife walking. And he said to me, when I gave him the article, he figured he'd never need it. And now with the virus and the urgency that the military has to face, as you know, we've had trouble on aircraft carriers. We're also using the military possibly to deal with the riots. I mean, there's a lot that the military is doing that it hasn't been doing and hasn't been really trained to do. And he said, you know, that article is coming in very handy. So let me stop there. We've got about 10 minutes, I think, Rabbi. And if anybody has some questions, I'll do my best to try to answer.
You can put them in the chat box, anybody. Thank you.
I see one here.
Okay, Washington Post has an article. Coronavirus ravaged Florida as Ron DeSantis, the Republican governor, sidelined scientists and followed Trump. So if coronavirus ravaged Florida, and there have been about 5,000 COVID-19 deaths in Florida, what did it do to New York, where there have been about 34,000 deaths? As Florida became a global epicenter of the coronavirus, Governor Ron DeSantis held one meeting this week with his top public health official. His health department has sidelined scientists, holding briefings last month with disease specialists and telling the experts there was not sufficient personnel from the state to continue participating. What does that mean?
Did I give my article to Kushner? The answer is I didn't give it to him, but somebody else gave it to him. I gave it to somebody. I am not a Trump fan. I'm not going to go any further in politics. But when Kushner came in, I felt that it might be of use to him. And somebody I know who's was close to the Trump team, who wasn't Jewish, I said, please give this to Jared Kushner. Got a question. Where do I get my book? The Nehemiah book you can get on the Koren website. They're actually offering, Koren is, I have another book that's was about to be published. And then unfortunately, the epidemic hit Israel, and it's put a stop to a lot of what Koren was doing. But because they're marketing their books as best they can, they're giving nice discounts, 10%, 20%, depends. So get on the Koren website, and you can get it there. There was somebody, Mark Shapiro, to everyone. Everyone says that Weinberger was an anti-Semite. You knew him very well. What do you say? Okay, let me look here. What do you say about this? He wasn't an anti-Semite. He had to deal with Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon's personality was such that he could make anybody an anti-Semite. He could make a Jew an anti-Semite. He was totally the opposite of Weinberger. In fact, Weinberger never got angry about anything, but he got angry at Ariel Sharon. Again, as I said, he not only let me go ahead and proceed with a whole modernization plan for the Israeli Navy, which was not only for their submarines, but also for their surface ships, which they use today. But there was a time when it was the Israelis were, and by the way, just as I put together a task force to evaluate the Levy with the best brains we had in the Air Force and in our Office of Program Evaluation, I put together a task force to look at the Israeli modernization program. We put out a report on that too. That task force included Israelis. It was a joint effort. I can't tell you everything about it because it's still a classified report. But Weinberger supported all that work. And he also, as I said, there was a time when the Israelis were thinking they might need something to be built in the United States or some systems to be built in the United States. Weinberger was all for it. And that, as I say, those submarines fire missiles that can hit Iran. The Levy couldn't have done that. So Weinberger wasn't bad that way. Another time, he was giving a speech to the American Jewish Committee, and he asked me to look the speech over. And I was really surprised at all the positive things he said. And apparently he was interrupted by applause a whole bunch of times. So I've been very, very cautious about labeling people anti-Semites. The only person I labeled an anti-Semite was somebody that George W. Bush also did. An interesting story, perhaps. When we were advising Bush, we used to go down to the governor's office in Austin. Well, one time we're coming out of the office, and I was the last one to come out with him, together with Rich Armitage, who later became Deputy Secretary of State and had also served as an Assistant Secretary in the Defense Department. Now, Armitage has adopted children of color. Very, very, very decent man. And he turns around, because this was at the time when Pat Buchanan was making a run for the nomination. He turns around to Bush, and he says to Bush, that Pat Buchanan is a goddamn SOB. And Bush, without missing a beat, said, and he's an anti-Semite too. It's the only person I've ever publicly called an anti-Semite. Brzezinski, for instance, has been called an anti-Semite. I knew Big Brzezinski very, very well. I met his wife. His son worked for me. When his other son was ambassador to Sweden, my wife and I stayed at his house. When I took Big's course at Columbia, I had my yarmulke on. He gave me a good grade anyway. He was very hurt that people called him an anti-Semite, because he wasn't. But he was Polish, and he wasn't super pro-Israel the way some people wanted, being he's an anti-Semite. Not the case at all. Why did Weinberger have such a burn for Pollard? A Jewish guy in the Office of General Counsel named Manny Briskin told me one day that Pollard gave away a room full of stuff, a roomful. As a result of the stuff he gave away, the Soviets were able to identify some of our people and put them away. There were most. How could that happen? Well, it turned out that the KGB had planted people even in the prime minister's office in Israel. And Pollard, by the way, offered his services first to South Africa before he offered them to Israel. So he made out that he was a Jewish martyr. He was no more a Jewish martyr than O.J. Simpson was a black martyr. And in fact, if Pollard really cared so much about Israel, all he had to do was make Aliyah. One time I was interviewed on television in Israel, and I was told, Pollard is the good Jew, you're the bad Jew. What do you say to that? And I said, look, he had delusions about himself. Why did he go first to South Africa? Why did he take money from Israel so that he could have dinners in Paris with his wife? All he had to do was go on Aliyah. He could have joined the Israeli military. So I have no time for Pollard. And what do I say about Pollard in general? I think I just answered that. Let's see. The article, where do you get my book? I think that's it. Any other questions?
So he wrote a book on Nehemiah in Hebrew. So Nehemiah served the Persian king and then arranged for the Jews to return to their land. It's a book in the Bible. I guess the biggest sin is still anti-Semitism, says Rustin. It's the biggest sin to Jews, right? Why would it not be to Jews? If you can see people clearly as being anti-Jewish, then it would make sense that anti-Semitism would be the biggest sin. Now, I don't agree that Pat Buchanan is an anti-Semite. I don't find the term anti-Semite useful, but I understand why many Jews do. Now that a goy would go around, like George W. Bush would go around and call Pat Buchanan or anyone else an anti-Semite, I think that's nonsense. That's special virtue signaling. Okay, so Washington Post article, coronavirus ravages Florida's Ron DeSantis, sidelines scientists and following Trump. So apparently Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis has not been meeting with scientists as often as the scientists would like. And according to the Washington Post, decision-making has become increasingly shaped by politics and divorced from scientific evidence. Well, science doesn't tell you how to respond to the coronavirus. That's a political decision. So, of course, decision-making should be shaped by politics. And if you're going to blast Ron DeSantis and Florida for their decision-making, then what do you say about New York, where you've had 5 times as many deaths? The crisis in Florida has revealed the shortcomings of a response built on shifting metrics influenced by a small group of advisors and tethered at every stage of the Trump administration, which has no unified plan for addressing the national health emergency but has pushed for states to reopen. But we have a federal system. Healthcare is not nationalized by and large in the United States. We have a federal system. So if we didn't have a federal system, then it would be more appropriate to criticize the Trump administration for not having a unified plan for addressing the national health emergency. Also, who's addressed this crisis more effectively? All right, there's so much that we don't know. And the Post criticizes Florida for a response built on shifting metrics. Well, metrics are shifting. The evidence is shifting. We're in something that's unprecedented for 100 years. And so a governor's response should be political. So Florida's response has sunk Florida into a deadly morass. Nearly 5,800 Floridians have now died of COVID-19. Yeah, about 1/5 as many in the state of New York. Now, I'm not saying that means that Florida is more effective or has better government than the state of New York. I'm just saying that this is a tendentious article by the Washington Post, which also published an essay, Held Back as Parents Realize How Badly the U.S. Botched the Next School Year. We're Furious, Dana Stevens writes. Nearly 5 months later, it's become apparent the Trump administration's abject negligence means we're about to repeat the lockdown anyway. The implicit bargain of the spring was that if everyone complied with the shutdowns, the isolation, the social distancing, the working while parenting disasters, and the rest, the government would use that time to build enough testing, tracing, and public health infrastructure so that students could safely go back to school in person in the fall. Instead, having utterly failed to contain the virus, the administration is now employing the crafty tactic of attempting to draw attention away from the pandemic. Kevin Michael Grace had the best response to this type of thinking. Essentially, she's arguing that if only Trump had waved his magic wand that would get rid of the COVID-19 problem, that everything would be well. Well, there isn't a magic wand. There's not a magic key. There's not a magic wand that will miraculously deal with COVID-19. So I'm sure the Trump administration has made mistakes. Which government has not made mistakes with regard to this problem? But essentially, her argument boils down to, I'm mad, I'm furious, we're furious because Trump hasn't waved his magic wand. And I don't find that a particularly strong argument. Also, I don't know why you get an argument that's essentially based on we're furious. Like, how is that an argument? We're furious. I mean, why are the feels so newsworthy? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about transparency. This is from Dennis Prager's radio show.
The people who want to make it the USSA, right? Union of Soviet Socialist Americans. They're not the happiest crowd, are they? So, my friends, I devote an hour a week to happiness. This one is going to be difficult for many of you. That's why I took a big exhale. Because prior to the big exhale, I took a big inhale. The issue to talk about today, that I will talk about today, is transparency. The more transparent you present yourself, the happier you will be. The more you feel you need to hide from others, the less happy you will be. Among other reasons is that when you hide, it's an effort. It doesn't take much effort to be transparent. It takes a lot of effort to hide parts of yourself. By definition, you will be walking around not trusting people. Why do you hide things about yourself? Because of the fear that people will reject you, if they knew that.
Dennis Prager made a good point that when you encounter people who say, oh, I'm a very private person, what they're really saying is, I don't trust anyone. And if you walk around with a high level of distrust of people and it's not warranted, if you go around hiding who you are, that is very tiring. I can do 20 hours a week of YouTube videos because essentially I'm pretty transparent. So I'm not having to hide things. I'm not racked with fear that you might discover something about me.
That's my subject. Why aren't you transparent? I, right before this, discussed the topic with the living martyr. Now, you might think because he's a living martyr and he presents an Easter Island, what are they called again? Easter Island what? Statue. That you would think, oh, if he's an Easter Island statue, he must not be transparent. But he's as transparent as I am. I see right through him. He sees right through
Alan, his producer, the guy who runs the whole thing, who's somewhere between my mom and an Easter Island head in terms of gregariousness and encouragement.
That was really priceless. Only Adam Carolla on Earth could come up with that. That is my belief. 1-8-Prager 776-877-243-776. So why aren't you transparent? That's my question to those of you who are not. What are you afraid of? You robbed a bank 8 years ago? I mean, I understand that. But I'm very serious. I don't relate to the lack of transparency that people aim for. My view, I guess, is, look, this is who I am. If you reject me, then fine.
So I think there is one area of your life where it pays not to be transparent, and that is with regard to sexuality. So if, for example, if you molested someone who's underage, you should probably not share that with people. There's all sorts of like sexual kinks and predilections that you probably should not share with your spouse. You should not tell your mate about meaning your spouse, about your past sexual endeavors. I think, generally speaking, a lot of discretion with regard to your sexual history is a good idea.
Fine. So I'll move on to somebody who will accept me. Why would you want to be accepted by people whom you hide from? Then you're not being accepted, correct? If you're closed, the people who like you are almost afraid of, right? If I really showed them who I was, then they wouldn't be in my life. 1-8-Prager 776-877-243-776. This is a very important subject. I don't know how you have close friendships if you're not transparent. I don't know how you have a good marital relationship if you're not transparent. It's a beautiful trait, worthy of developing. It's something that I have realized my whole life. And it's a powerful thing. 1-8 Prager 776. I hope our lines are working here because I don't see anything coming up, so I will just continue. On the happiness hour, it never happens, so I don't know if we have a breakdown of our system. These are the two most important hours for the phone lines to work. But it is. But you have a conscious decision. I mean, there may be children where that's not true, but I don't know how that would be. This is truly a significant subject. There is no gain in non-transparency because it's sort of like you know you're faking it. Really, when you think about it, what is it? I would love to know. This is one of the great values to me personally of doing the radio show. Getting to hear from so many people is almost unique. I mean, very few people have this opportunity. I mean, ironically, everyone.
So when you're dominant in the dominance hierarchy, it's a lot easier to be transparent because everyone essentially has to bend to Dennis Prager. Right? Conflict is too tiring a way to resolve differences, and negotiation is, generally speaking, too tiring a way to resolve differences. So generally speaking, the way we conduct our lives is that when we come to a disagreement, then the person who is dominant, the subordinate person, will accede to the dominant person's wishes. So let's say you have a spouse who earns 3 times as much money as you do. Generally speaking, that spouse is going to be the dominant one in your relationship, and they're going to make the decisions. Let's say you have a friend who's much higher status than you are. Then, generally speaking, when the two of you disagree, if you want to keep him in your life, you're going to have to accede to his wishes. And if your boss tells you to do something that you don't want to do, if you want to stay employed, you need to accede to the boss's wishes because he's dominant in the dominance hierarchy. Now, when Dennis Prager walks into a room, people just flock to him. He has a charismatic, magnetic presence, and he's been this way since childhood. Like, people used to come early to appointments with Dennis's father, Max, who was an accountant, just so they could hang out and talk with a teenage Dennis Prager. Throughout high school, Dennis Prager was consistently elected the president of his class. So the man oozes charisma, and people are attracted to him. And so it's a lot easier to be transparent when you're dominant. So when you're subordinate, you need to use a lot more discretion, because you don't want to be revealing things that will put you at odds with those around you, because you're a lot more disposable when you're subordinate. When you're dominant, as Dennis Prager, it's a lot easier to be transparent, because he can effectively say to other people, this is how I am, like it or leave it, like it or lump it. Most people don't have this luxury.
You have the opportunity just listening to the show. You have the same opportunity I do. You really do learn a lot about human beings. I would like to know, ideally, I would like to know, what is it you hide and why? Who do you think will reject you? I have to believe that that's what it is. I'll give you a tiny example. When I started radio, I decided if I were interviewing a guest and they said something and I didn't understand it, it was a new subject or something I just didn't understand, or they used a word I didn't understand, would I go, to give the impression to the listeners that I knew exactly what the person was saying? Or do I say, I'm sorry, could you explain that to me? That was a conscious decision to be transparent. I was not going to hold back from listeners that I was ignorant about something.
Okay, let me just play a brief clip here from Sam Hyde on Power.
You know what? The idea that people in power use that power to preserve that power, lawfully or unlawfully, that's crazy. Put your head in an oven. Kill yourself right now if you think that's the case. If you think that people do surreptitious, secretive things to gain power, to maintain power, for fun, for whatever reason, if you think that human nature includes the capacity to be dishonest, something is wrong with you. Drive into a wall at 120 miles an hour in a Mercedes. Michael Hastings, crackpot conspiracy theorist. Bye-bye, fuckhead. Look him up, Michael Hastings. Horrible guy.
So Dennis Prager's on his 3rd marriage. He's had 2 divorces, so not sure, not saying one way or another. I do think it's relevant to considering how wise is this advice, particularly with regard to your relationships.
And by the way, that way I learned, I've told you this, and it's made an impact on you. It's an amazing thing, the aphorisms in Hebrew that I learned in my religious education from elementary school through high school. There must have been 100 aphorisms, every one of which changed my life. There's a very famous one, it's thousands of years old, a Jewish saying in Hebrew, I'll just tell it to you in English, the easily embarrassed does not learn. And I thought, wow, that is brilliant. Do you know that is one of the ways I learned the languages that I learned? Because I was never afraid to make mistakes in the countries that spoke those languages. If people laughed at me, I could handle it. But they never laughed at me. They laughed with me. Do you ever laugh at anybody from a foreign country who speaks English with a mistake? Of course not. You're just dazzled that they could speak English at all. I'm dazzled by that. I made a mistake in Hebrew once, which is what I speak pretty close to fluently. In Hebrew, the word for taxi service and the word for bathroom is the same, or very close. They're the same, basically. So I walked around the Tel Aviv bus terminal asking, hey, where are the toilets to Jerusalem? And everybody cracked up, and when I learned why, I cracked up too.
The Dennis Prager Show.
Hey, a reminder, my friends, My Pillow is the official sponsor of the Happiness Hour. Mike Lindell does a lot of good for this country, and the product is awesome. I sleep on the pillow, and all right. We get 2 standard My Pillows for free, and save 30%. Big deal. This is the Happiness Hour, and subject is transparency. The more you hide, the less happy you will be. And I'd like to know what people are afraid of. So that's really what's going to help me a lot here. All right, Mike in Springfield, Pennsylvania.
So what are people afraid of? I noticed that married men, generally speaking, tend to be most afraid of their wives. So are there married men who are not afraid of their wives?
Pennsylvania. Where is Springfield, Pennsylvania?
Hi, Dennis. Love your show.
Thank you. Where is Springfield?
Let's see. I know what you're trying to do here.
Happy 20 miles from. So I simply want to know.
We trust on the coin.
That's great.
In Britain, PA.
I didn't know that. That's great. All right. Transparency is what you wanted to talk about. Yeah.
Awesome. Being transparent, you're going to be transparent about like a non-moral thing where, like maybe, and you're going to get in trouble with the wife or the family. And an example would be like a man who maybe likes to view dirty movies or look at women when his wife's not present. If he's transparent about that, he's in trouble.
Well, that's why I have a male-female hour so that wives won't get their husbands in trouble. No. A lot of men fear opening up about their sexual nature to their wives. This is very common and very sad. And it's something. It's like saying to your husband, I don't really want to know about you. And so I feel for you about this, but that's why I've waged a battle on behalf of opening up about male sexuality. I mean, just watch my video, The Power of the Visual. And let me just tell you, my friends, I got this all from...
So the chat's wondering, what does it mean that Dennis Prager did not succeed in New York? I think New York is much more traditional and much more ethnic, and people have much stronger group identities, generally speaking, in New York. So people who move west, generally speaking, I think they're trying to get away from family and from the stifling ethnic and religious ties that dominate life back east. So Dennis Prager is very individualistic. He has an eclectic approach to Judaism. So perhaps that has something to do with his lack of success in New York City, where religion's taken much more seriously in New York City. Ethnic ties, generally speaking, are taken more seriously in New York City than, say, on the West Coast.
My dad. My father was an Orthodox Jew. He was the president of an Orthodox synagogue. And my father was as open about sex to his children, I was one of the two, and to his wife, my mother, as he was about politics or baseball. I was raised to know it is part of life. Now, if there are people who have religious issues, and I'm not putting that down, I understand. My father got Playboy magazine. His children, my brother and I knew it. My mother knew it. It didn't bother her. He was faithful and he loved her. They were married 72 years. So I just, that's how I was raised. You don't hide. My father did not hide his nature. And my mother loved him. Did she love male sexual nature to a certain extent? Because she loved the virility of my father.
Every year.
I'll never forget when I was dating in my 20s. I didn't marry till 32. I was on a date one night. I don't think I told this the story. So I was on a date with I would say I was about 28. And I never talk trivia on dates. It's just because it bores me. So we were talking about men and women. And I said, what kind of man would you want? I said, this is the kind of man I want. Then we were talking about sexual nature, I think. And she said, I want a man who has a very strong libido and a strong sexual urge, but that he only wants me. And I said something to the effect, good luck. It doesn't exist. I know I get calls from men, I only want my wife. Okay, I don't understand that. Men are not made. It's like saying, I only want apple pie. Okay, it doesn't make sense. As great as your love for your wife is, males are made to want many females. That is male nature. You should be able to say that to your wife, and she should figure out a way not to be threatened because you are conquering your nature.
And looking at the chat, Glib says, I seem to recall Dennis Prager blaming his New York failure on being too much of a gentleman. And Half Galician says, Michael Savage's New York success seems to negate that theory. I don't know. Why does that negate my theory? Dennis Prager says that ethnic ties don't matter, that blood doesn't matter, that blood ties don't matter. He has a very individualist approach to life. So I don't know how Michael Savage's New York success negates that theory. Rush is huge in New York City too. So Rush and Michael Savage, they're much more visceral. So Dennis does quite an elevated show. So there's virtually no name calling on Prager's show. He doesn't demean people. He has very, generally speaking, polite conversations. Lib Medley says Rush is funnier. Michael Savage is a better storyteller than Dennis, and Rush is funnier. Luke, when are you moving to Israel? I'm not sure. Not sure. Here's Dennis on the power of the
Every
visual.
year, men spend billions of dollars to look at women with little clothing on, such as the annual Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, or with no clothing on, such as on internet sites and in so-called men's magazines. Women, on the other hand, spend virtually nothing to see unclothed men. Why? Some say that the reason is that men are socialized into viewing women as sex objects, and that women are...
Now, you may think this is all elementary, and of course, doesn't everyone know this? Well, actually, I know quite a few men who have shared this with their wives, and it has come as a revelation. They didn't want to believe it, they didn't want to accept it, but when they heard it from someone who's a stranger, they heard it from Dennis Prager, that it seemed to have had more of an effect. So I remember when I was living with my parents, when I was sidelined by chronic fatigue syndrome, my parents knew that I really enjoyed talking to this handyman who came around, who was a Protestant Christian married with like 6 or 7 kids, that I really enjoyed talking to him and sharing Dennis Prager's tapes with him. And he took Dennis Prager's tapes on men, women, and the power of the visual. He took the tape home to his wife and played it to her. And it seemed to have some effect. So yeah, we all take everything Dennis Prager is saying here for granted, but a lot of women don't. And often it is more powerful when a stranger breaks news to you rather than your husband.
are socialized into not viewing men as sex objects. But if that's true, how do these people explain gay men? They are as aroused by pictures of naked men as heterosexual men are aroused by pictures of naked women. Obviously, then, it's not socialization. It's that men are programmed by nature, not by society, to respond sexually to the visual. This is an area in which men are so different from women that it's probably impossible. No, not probably, just outright impossible for a woman to truly understand. Of course, women find some men attractive. And of course, a woman can have an intense reaction to seeing a very appealing man. But there's still no comparison. The visual alone arouses men. It takes far more to arouse a woman than seeing naked men. If that's all it took, most husbands would walk around the house naked whenever possible, or at least every time they wanted sex. And the average heterosexual man is excited countless times a day simply by seeing women, in person, on billboards, in magazines, on television, and even in his imagination. This is not the case for women. Yes, there are some male strip shows for women, but few women ever go, and the few who do attend them in groups, a girls' night out. And for every one of those shows, there are probably 10,000 female strip shows for males, most of whom attend alone, not as a participant in a guy's night out. Let's be honest, there is no magazine featuring men's legs for women to look at and get aroused by. But there are websites and magazines of women's legs for men. And are women paying to view topless men? Men pay good money to look at topless women. Again, that doesn't mean women never get turned on by merely looking at some men. Of course they do. But it's only some men, on rare occasion a stranger, and more usually a celebrity. Men get turned on by any sight of female flesh on almost any female. The effect of the visual in men is so powerful that it even amazes men. A man came over to me after hearing me lecture on male sexuality and said, "I've got a story to tell you. I was in front of a department store and the window was a seated mannequin. I couldn't believe it, but I found myself looking up her skirt." Here was a perfectly normal, responsible man who found himself looking up a skirt on an inanimate object shaped like a woman. That's how instinctive it is for men to look at female flesh. It's perfectly understandable that women cannot fully relate to this. But if a woman wants to understand male sexuality, the first thing she has to understand is the power of the visual. That's why you see ads on billboards, on TV, and in magazines for every sort of product a man might buy, accompanied by a scantily clad woman, or sometimes just part of her. I recall a famous liquor ad that showed a woman's legs and a bottle of tequila. No face, just beautiful legs. Would you ever see an ad showing men's legs? People would laugh. It would be considered absurd. An ad with women's legs is not absurd. It's alluring. None of this is in any way meant to excuse inappropriate male behavior. Men must always control themselves. But to deny the power of the visual on men is like denying that the earth is round.
So when a man's pants fall down in a movie, it's funny, but when a woman's skirt comes off, people don't tend to be laughing.
To conquer your nature as a man, and your wife has to conquer her nature as a woman. Life is, in a nutshell, conquering our natures. But to deny your nature to your own wife, she is asking you to be non-transparent. I knew this would come up when I raised the transparency issue. I knew it. And that's why I didn't know it would come up on that call, but I knew it would come up. I have another one on that. I will do it. Sarasota, Florida, Philip. And Philip does not know Mike. Hi.
Pleasure to talk to you. A long-time caller, long-time listener, first-time caller.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree with you more on what you just said. It is definitely our nature to want to connect with multiple women. I have that nature, no question about it. My issue is the fact that I've got some sexual addiction, for which I've been to programs.
All right, hold on. I want to hear more about that. That is a very complex issue, much more complex than drug addiction or alcohol addiction.
The Dennis Prager Show.
The first was from a man hiding his sexual nature from his wife. So I addressed that, and we have another caller, Sarasota, Philip, Sarasota, Florida. Okay, so go ahead. So are you married?
Yes.
And you've gone to Sexual Addicts Anonymous?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Go
great
on.
Program.
Good.
Great program.
AAs are all great. Yep.
I learned all the foundational things to keep me healthy, sane, and moving in a productive life. My problem is that nature never completely goes away. There's always these looking at the neighbor walking her dog. I used to have a big issue with internet porn and things like that. That part's been cleaned up a lot. But the point is that nature is still with me, and I have not had the courage to go forward to my wife and say, hey, this still bugs me. By the way, I did tell her before we got married, I said, look, I've been through a sexual addiction program. I feel very good about it. I feel very clean and changed, but you should know that up front. She was fine with it. So as far as she's concerned, I'm fine. I did what I needed to do and so forth. But I can't tell you the number of times that I've said to myself, go and talk to her about this recurring issue and have the courage to live a better life.
Why don't you show her the video? I think I did it, right? The power of the visual. There are two videos. It's easier for you to show her something than for you to speak, because it's always easier to have a stranger. I'm the stranger in this case. I have two videos up there on behalf of the males of the universe. PragerU. And one of them is the power of the visual, and the other is He Wants You, because it forthrightly deals with the issue of men looking at all these women, but really they want ultimately the woman that they love. So please show her those and then have a discussion. I don't want you.
So let's say you're married to a sex addict. How do you know when he's in danger of losing his sobriety? So it's when the resentment starts to build up, the anger starts to build up, or the fear starts to build up, and then people can't live with these unwanted emotions of fear, resentment, anger. And so they look for an out. They look for a way to escape from that anxiety. And that's when people are most likely to act out. So for me, I know lust does not serve me. And the longer I linger in a state of lust, the more danger I'm in, because one thought leads to another. So I have some days where I have virtually no conscious lust. And if I allow the lust to occupy more and more of my time, then it starts to have an effect on my behavior, the way I speak to women, the way I act around women, and it diminishes my happiness level. So I have to maintain a strong spiritual connection to God, working with sponsees to be able to go through each day with serenity rather than the overwhelming anxiety that would previously lead me to act out in this field.
To hide your nature. I don't want you to obsess over it with her. You don't have to. I am so incapable. I'm truly, I admit it, I'm incapable of not being transparent. I'm transparent to you, so you can only imagine my wife. And she's a remarkable woman, and she's extremely rational. It's a very rare gift in either sex. And she now just gets a kick out of it. She will point out some sexy-looking woman when we're,
So Half Galatian says, if women didn't understand the power of visual, why do they dress the way they do? Precisely because they understand. Yeah, they understand from their perspective, and they understand that they will get a lot nicer treatment if they look good. But that doesn't mean that they understand the ferocity of the male sexual drive. They only understand it insofar as it pertains to them and to the way that men relate to them. So men have much higher levels of testosterone, and that's why you have a lot more famous men who act out sexually and have sexual scandals than you do famous women. Like, when was the last time some female politician got into a sexual scandal? It's quite rare because women have low levels of testosterone. So generally speaking, people understand things only to the degree that they directly impinge on them.
like on the road and so on. And it's such a relief to me. I don't have to hide. I mean, of course, I want her. I love her. But I'm a male. You might as well blame me for wanting food. All righty. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Ginger. Hello, Ginger. Dennis Prager.
Hi, Dennis. Can you hear me?
I can, perfectly.
Oh, perfect. Well, I was married for the second time, and I was 59 years old, and I had been sexually abused as a teenager for a few years
by whom?
By a family member.
Uh-huh.
By a family member.
Forgive me, immediate family or an uncle or cousin?
No, it was immediate, Dennis.
Wow.
And it shut me down. I was a teenager. It shut me down. And finally, at age 59, I was going to get married for the second time, and I said to my husband, my future husband, that I wanted to be transparent and I wanted to have intimacy with one man before I died. I said, I don't know if it's you or not because we're just meeting for the second time, but this is what I want. I'm going to get rid of this old stuff. And Dennis, he couldn't handle it. He pretended like he could, but it took him about 10 years of bringing it up over and over. We went to therapy over and over when he would have maybe a glass or two of wine or a martini.
Oh, God. I got to react to that.
Yeah, so I think with regard to sexuality, often discretion is the better part of valor. Some men can't handle hearing about how you were molested or raped, right? And a lot of wives don't want to hear about their husband's sex life prior to meeting them. So just because someone says that they can handle something, that you can tell them anything, doesn't mean it's true, particularly in the sexual arena. There are certain things that you can say that other people, even if they claim that they'll be able to handle it, they just won't be able to handle it. All sorts of sexual things will overshadow everything else about a person. So I do disagree with Dennis here. I do think that there's much more room for discretion, and I think generally speaking, it'd be wise for a woman, say, not to share about how she was molested or how she was raped. I remember I dated an ex-porn star, and at first it meant nothing to me. It was just meant she was particularly skilled at sex. But as I started to have more and more sex with her and hang out with her, the more strongly I started to feel about her, then the less I was able to handle her prior sex work. And all sorts of porn stars say this, that all sorts of men tell them, oh yeah, I can handle it. But then as soon as the relationship gets going, the men, probably 95% of men, cannot handle that their girlfriend or wife used to be a sex worker.
The more transparent you are, the happier you will be. And our caller from Pittsburgh spoke about how her transparency actually was not received well by her second husband. Listen, that's correct. There are people who can't handle it. So then they're not people you want to be particularly intimate with. I don't mean just sexually intimate, just intimate. So that's it's certainly not an argument against transparency. I don't think she was making one. She was saying some people can't handle it.
It is an argument against transparency because people don't know what they can handle and what they can't handle. Think about Sarai in the Bible. She tells Avram, oh, go make a baby with my handmaiden Hagar. Hagar gets pregnant. Hagar lords it over Sarai, and Sarai can't handle it. And so she starts yelling at Avram for doing the very thing that she told him to do. So all sorts of people claim that they can handle things that, in fact, they cannot handle, and much of this is in the realm of sex.
Okay. If we had more time, I would ask her why she married him in light of that, but I want to take as many calls as I can. All righty, everybody. Let's go to Greenwood, South Carolina. John, hello.
Hi, Dennis. Good to talk to you today. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Listen, my premise is this, that we can't be completely transparent even with ourselves because we all have innate confirmation bias. Are you familiar with that psychological term?
No.
Okay, so a confirmation bias is heavily seen on the left, but everybody is guilty of it. Essentially, confirmation bias is this, that when we view the world through a filter, and our filter is essentially this, that everything that we see, everything we hear, experience, encounter, confirms what we already believe. And so we can't actually talk to each other, and we can't really talk to each other ourselves. On that basis, let me give you an example in you.
Right, that's true. So we don't always see ourselves accurately, and we don't always understand what we can handle and what we can't handle. Okay, I want to go back to talking about tabloid journalists. Interesting article by Rod Lurie. He wrote 2 lengthy essays in Los Angeles Magazine about the National Enquirer. And so he found out that Anthony Pellicano, who acted on behalf of the National Enquirer, was paying Rod Lurie's research assistant for Rod's notes and to monitor the progress of Rod's article about the National Enquirer. And then Rod Lurie's article noted that tabloid reporters became specialists at falsifying sources as a way to meet the publication's 3-source requirement to back themselves up legally. So they would do all sorts of phony paperwork to claim that they'd met with a source that never actually happened. Rod Lurie uncovered that National Enquirer reporters would steal hospital records for celebrities, which is, of course, illegal, that they would steal mail, that they would file false police reports, they would telephone to Child Protective Services, report that some celebrity had been abusing her kids, and then they would stake out the home when Child Protective Services sent a representative over. then they take photos and say, Child Protective Services is investigating Tom Arnold or Roseanne Arnold, even though there's no basis for the allegations. Then they would go into a home that, say, a celebrity had rented, and they'd break windows and create a massive mess. Then they'd take photos and say, oh, look at the condition this celebrity left this rented home. So National Enquirer reporters would routinely lie, manufacture sources. They would file false police reports. They would break into homes and damage them to try to make celebrities such as Farrah Fawcett, Ryan O'Neal, give them blackmail material. So they're always looking for blackmail material over celebrities, try to catch them in compromising positions, and then turn the celebrity into what's called a friend of the tabloids. So the Enquirer would get photos of celebrities in compromising positions, and then they wouldn't run the story because the celebrity would be too popular, and to bash the celebrity might backfire and alienate readers. But they would use the photos in the story to blackmail celebrities to get them on side. The celebrities would then cooperate with the National Enquirer and feed them stories about other people. Then they would steal mail from people like Madonna and Faye Dunaway. It was so routine, the stealing of mail, that reporters had a name for it, playing mailman. They would go to a celebrity's local post office and fill out a forwarding address form for the celebrity and reroute the star's mail to a prearranged address. Okay.
Who don't believe there can be any developments. And then they're stuck with a problem because you look at it, why is it that we seem to have more attention to human rights than the great rabbi from 300 years ago? But it's what there's a scholar called Findlay, he called it the teleological fallacy. Teleological fallacy means you look at people from hundreds of years ago and assume that they shared our exact values, which is, of course, nonsense. We know that people even 20 years ago, and ourselves 20 years ago, do not have the same values. If you would have told me 20 years ago that there's an idea of transgender and that these are things that we could not even comprehend. So, and all this influences the halachic system. Incidentally, none other than the Chazon Ish said something interesting in this regard. Mentions that the Chafetz Chaim, there's a law that you can't study near a light on Shabbos, on Friday night, because you might need more light and you might tilt it to you. It's not referring, the Gemara uses the word ner. It doesn't mean candle. It means lamp, because it's an oil lamp, and you go like that to get the oil would come. But the Chafetz Chaim is lenient on it, and the Chazon Ish said the reason he was lenient is because his love of Torah. He couldn't bear that people would not be studying Torah. So that was a criticism of the Chafetz Chaim. Modern Orthodox poskim have recognized that there's been moral advances that have occurred. Here's maybe some of you know this figure, Rav Yuval Shirlo. He's among the young, not so young anymore, but the non-Orthodox rabbis in Israel. He has a book called Reshut Rabbim, and he develops the idea that there's moral progress in the area, let's say, of civil rights, human rights. And he says, true religious people believe that this is the will of God, and this will influence how you decide halacha consciously. But much more interesting, unconsciously, how you view it. Much more interesting, I think, is than this unconscious subjective element is the conscious subjective element. When the posek has an agenda, and he says, I'm going to see if Jewish law can work with this. And there are many examples. So I don't even want to talk about the Talmud. The Talmud is full of legislation based on this. But the Talmud, they could do that. I'm interested afterwards. So, another example dealing with women. The rabbis, when you offer a sacrifice, there's this thing where you put your hands on it. It's called smicha, and it says they allowed the women to do it because it gave them nachat ruach. They enjoyed it. The halacha didn't dictate this concern. It was the rabbis, seeing the feelings of women, so they changed how things are done. But that's very interesting. A lot of people cite it because it shows, interest in women's understanding to change tradition. But I don't want to focus on the rabbis of the Talmud because they were creating the oral law. They had the ability to make drashot, to derive things from the Torah. I'm more interested in an era when Jewish law is already codified. So let me give you some examples from the post-Talmudic halachists. Well, one common thing is you often have in the later rabbis, medieval to the early modern, they have this idea called limud zchut. What is limud zchut? When the Jewish people are doing something that appears to be forbidden, but these are pious people doing it, you try to find some justification for it. You have an agenda. You're going to try to find, in fact, Rav Moshe Meir Katzenellenbogen, it's called the Maram Padua, he writes in his responsa, we must strenuously attempt to justify this practice. We don't want people to be sinners. That's conscious subjectivity trying to find a justification. The author tells us he has an agenda. That doesn't mean he's going to be able to, but he's going to try to. You have this issue in England as well that the Trumas Adeshin in Germany discussed in the summer. It gets dark very late. The very first response in his book deals with how is it that people are davening and saying Shema and Shema Esrei hours before it's dark. When the Gemara, we know in the Shulchan Aruch that you can't do this until it's dark out. So it's a problem. You say that no one is a good Jew. They're not waiting up till in the summer in some places.
Okay, let's talk about Rupert Murdoch's British tabloids. Exactly how bad are they? This is a book by Paul Barry on Rupert Murdoch and the fight to succeed him at News Corporation. It's an interesting question whether Rupert Murdoch is aware of these various News of the World campaigns of vilification or is indeed responsible for them. His ex-butler, Philip Townsend, told Channel 4 in 2011 that it was Rupert Murdoch who set his paper onto the TV host Ann Diamond, who asked him embarrassing questions. He rung his editors to complain that she'd been rude to him. She reports, having asked that one question of Rupert Murdoch, I was hounded and vilified on his newspaper front pages for years. The effect upon me and my family cannot be overstated. The coverage was persistent, cruel, grossly intrusive, and enormously damaging and hurtful. It did indeed feel as though I was being targeted. In 1990, after a series of far more vicious attacks on the openly gay TV host Russell Harty, who the Sun insisted had died of AIDS, despite vehement denials by his doctors, Rupert Murdoch told the BBC that he read every issue of the News of the World and the Sun, was extremely proud of both papers. How on earth could you be extremely proud of the News of the World and the Sun? Even when you see someone's life has been stomped on, their prospects ruined, and their family's life dragged through the mire, Wogan inquired. Very, very rarely see that in the Sun, Rupert replied. We believe that people who set themselves up in positions of privilege or as public figures or as public role models and either make money from that or get power from that, we believe that they should be looked at. Fair enough, but did that really justify the way they had persecuted Russell Harty for his sexuality? If Rupert Murdoch ever did take such matters seriously and rein in these excesses, it never lasted for long, and there's no reason to think that he had a problem with the genre. His office in Los Angeles was plastered with the front pages of the Sun and the News of the World, and he loved his tabloids. He delighted in telling people about the dirt they had collected on politicians and public figures. We have pictures of him, he often boasted to his biographer Michael Wolff. Found Rupert most entertaining and caustic on the subject of other people's losses, lapses, and screw-ups, and he loved to trade tidbits. There are two currencies in the Murdoch organization, Andrew Neil, the ex-editor of the Sunday Times, observed. One is money, the second is gossip. Rupert loves gossip. Rupert didn't worry too much about who got hurt. Another to suffer at the hands of Murdoch's British tabloids was the famous young singing star Charlotte Church. Even though she had performed for Rupert at his wedding to Wendy Dang in 1999, then just 13 years old, the child prodigy had already sung for the Pope, the Vatican's Christmas service, and for President Clinton at the White House. So the fee she was offered to perform on Rupert's yacht Morning Glory, where the marriage took place, was a handsome £100,000. But she was persuaded by her managers to forego the cash in exchange for favorable treatment from the Murdoch papers in a deal brokered by Murdoch's daughter Elizabeth's consort Matthew Freud. Call it advertising, PR, or protection money, she soon found that it spectacularly failed to deliver. So Charlotte Church, whose debut album was titled Voice of an Angel, was pursued from the age of 14 by most of Britain's tabloids who liked to portray her as the devil in disguise because she wasn't quite as chaste or pure as her image suggested. But it was the Sun and the News of the World who led the pack, with the former featuring a tasteless clock that counted down the days to her 16th birthday when she could legally lose her virginity, and the latter running stories about her mother's suicide attempt. In between, they got stuck into, remember, she's a teenage girl, less than 16 years of age. They got stuck into the singer about her weight. Just imagine, like, you're a 12-year-old girl, a 14-year-old girl, and the tabloids are going after you for your weight, her drinking, her smoking, and her private life. It was utterly horrifying and devastating to my family, Church said. December 2005, the News of the World ran a picture of the then 19-year-old in a huge front-page splash, Church's 3-in-a-bed cocaine shock, which told its readers, Voice of an Angel star Charlotte Church flew into a furious rage at stepdad James after discovering he's a cocaine-snorting love cheat. Inside, in an even bigger double-page spread, it boasted, Superstar Charlotte Church's mom tried to kill herself because her husband is a love rat hooked on cocaine and 3-in-a-bed orgies the News of the World can reveal. Then quoted the stepfather's mistress as saying, he goes off effing anything that moves, telling his wife to drink herself into a stupor. It was hell for her. She was in turmoil, thought she was going to lose the man she loves. Having run this story, which was almost guaranteed to make Church's mother try again to take her own life, paper's reporters blackmailed Maria into talking to them. News of the World wanted an exclusive story of her breakdown, self-harming, and attempted suicide in exchange for not printing a follow-up story about my father's infidelity, Church revealed. She felt she had no choice other than to play by their rules. And the News of the World was then edited by Andy Coulson, who went on to be the Prime Minister David Cameron's communications head. The News of the World then ran another front-page exclusive in which singer Charlotte Church's distraught mom could tell the News of the World how the young singer had found her unconscious after an overdose, how she had repeatedly slashed herself with knives to cope with the agony of her husband's cocaine-fueled three-in-a-bed fling. According to Charlotte Church, the sequence of events drove my mother to additional self-harm, had a dramatic impact on her mental health. Meanwhile, Charlotte's TV jobs dried up, sponsors abandoned her. She dumped several close friends because she became convinced they were leaking personal stories about her.
In the north, you know what time it could be get dark there. People can't stay up that late. So he consciously tells us that he's going to see if he can find a justification for it. Let me give you the women's issue as well. Pesach, we recline, correct? The Talmud tells us that only an important woman should reclines. Men all have to recline, but only an important woman. But in the Mordechai, he's an important medieval authority, he says that, he quotes someone as saying that today all our women are important. We treat all our women important, and therefore all women need to recline. So that's a conscious reevaluation of the halacha in accordance with an alternative view of women. And we're talking medieval times here. Incidentally, this business of reclining, which people still do, it seems. There is a posek in Lakewood who actually says that today we don't recline ever when we eat. So he doesn't think there's any idea of reclining at all on Pesach. So if you feel guilty and you have your Seder, you're not reclining and everything, at least you know there is a posek who holds that it's very anachronistic to recline today. Remember, they used to sit back when they would eat on these couches and everything. And I could give you many, many examples of this. The one I just spoke about in my class last night, I gave a weekly class, was we got into the issue of machine matzah. And there was a big dispute to whether that was permitted when it first began. And one of the big opponents of it, his name was Shlomo Kluger, great posek. But one of his reasons actually for opposing it is he says that a lot of women, for a month before Passover, they make their living, at least a bit of a parnassa by preparing the matzahs, with the dough and everything and help making the matzah. And if we permit machine matzah, that'll be terrible for them. And the response to this was by...
Right, so that's like, remember when Ben Shapiro interviewed Tucker Carlson, and Tucker Carlson said that he would ban self-driving trucks because the most prominent job for men who did not graduate high school is to drive a truck. And so this is referring to a rabbinic discussion. How can we preserve a living for women who are making matzahs? Perhaps we should just ban machine-made matzahs, which the flat, unleavened bread that the Jews eat on Passover.
Rabbi Yosef Shalom Nachmanson, the great posek who permitted machine matzahs, says that's very nice, but we don't decide halacha based. We're not dealing with some socialist system here that we're going to say that something's forbidden because people are going to lose their income. If that was the case, we wouldn't have computers because the typewriter went out of business. In Manhattan, in London also, you had people, let's say up into the late 80s when the fax machine was invented, they would be on bicycles. If you're a law firm, you have to get a document to the other side of town. They get it there in an hour on the bicycle. Well, now we don't need these people. But with Shlomo Kluger, he was consciously saying that we need to be concerned with these women who make a living, at least a partial living. And so that's non-halachic values influencing him consciously. I'd say meta-halachic values. The final example I'll give along these lines, because we're speaking to people in London, Rabbi Cheskel Bromsky. He was dying on the London Basin. For that, he was in the Machzik Yadas. He has a response. I'm dealing with the kashrus of gelatin. Is gelatin kosher? And this was a big debate. Many great rabbis held that it was Rav Avad Yosef, for instance, today, and Rav Chaim Ozer-Brzezinski.
Okay, back to Murdoch's tabloids. Another famous singer, Elton John, had an even worse time at the hands of the Sun. Way back in the 1980s when Calvin Mackenzie was running the paper, Mackenzie, who was then Murdoch's favorite editor, claimed to understand his readers and behaved like Rupert, that his journalists should write with their prejudices in mind. He's the bloke you see in the pub. The right old fascist wants to send the wogs back by his poxy council house. He's afraid of the unions, afraid of the Russians, hates the queers and the weirdos and the drug dealers. And Elton John, of course, was a queer or a pufta, as Rupert would have described him. Thus, almost 20 years before George Michael graced the cover of the News of the World, he was all over the front page of The Sun in a story headed, Elton Invites Boys Scandal. Inside the paper, in a mandatory double-page spread, the tale unfolded with Elton's lust for bondage. This extraordinarily defamatory article, which alleged that Elton John had indulged in drug-fueled S&M sessions, was based on the uncorroborated evidence of a homosexual prostitute who had not even mentioned Elton's name at his first meeting with The Sun. He was also being paid handsomely for his revelations, which gave him an obvious incentive to invent or embellish. The paper's lawyers strongly advised Mackenzie not to run the story, as did several senior journalists, and told him there's no chance of proving it to be true. Yet Mackenzie went ahead, ran it anyway, on the basis that it sounded right to him. Elton John, who was in Australia recovering from a cancer scare, immediately denied the allegations and announced he would sue the paper. The Sun then raised the stakes with another story headline, Elton's Kinky Kinks and Elton's Drug Capers, whereupon Elton John sued again. When they hit him with another "You're a liar, Elton," he issued a third writ. Before long, the Sun's rivals were investigating the story and ripping it to shreds, not least by proving that the singer had been in New York on one of the dates on which he had supposedly been tied up in a London orgy. Assuming that Elton John would never dare have his private life packed over in court, the Sun whisked the rent boy out of the country to Marbella, put him up for a month in a 5-star hotel, all expenses paid. But their prize witness soon tired of this and flew home to London, where he was arrested by the Vice Squad. The newspaper then hired another homosexual ex-prostitute to find new witnesses to the singer's sex life, paying £1,750 for each affidavit he secured and further £500 to any rent boys he persuaded to come to the party. So a rent boy is a male prostitute. We used to bring people to hotel rooms. They would tell us that they had an affair with Elton and that this was pure crap, the prostitute later told Thames TV, admitting that he had 9 convictions for fraud and 1 for attempted murder. This is the type of person that the Sun in London is relying on to make their stories stand up in a court of law. The Sun's chances of proving its case took another huge hit when their original and only source for the story recanted and admitted he had made it all up. It's all a pack of lies. I did it for the money, he said. The Sun was easy to con. I've never met Elton John, never been to one of his concerts or bought one of his records. By this time, Elton John had issued a total of 17 lawsuits against the newspaper. Yet the Sun still continued its crusade, paying £10,000 for 10-year-old pictures of a naked Elton with his male lover, which they splashed as Elton's porno photo shame, before they finally alleged that he debarked his vicious Rottweiler dogs and turned them into silent assassins. This created additional problem because, as the Sun's photographer soon discovered, the dogs were actually Alsatians and they barked. Eventually, on the first day of what promised to be the defamation trial of the decade, the Sun decided it was time to give in and admit it was wrong. Duly published a huge front-page apology headed "Sorry, Elton," which made it clear that the paper had no basis for making any of its allegations and had paid him a record £1 million in damages. But despite the fact that the Sun had made a string of factual errors, published a deeply damaging story with no public interest justification, without a shred of reliable evidence, Rupert still allowed Kelvin Mackenzie to keep his job as an editor, even though he had driven the coverage. It was no wonder the poor man couldn't tell Essex from ethics.
The past held that gelatin was permissible because even if it comes from a pig, its form is so changed that it's not considered food. Rabbi Abramsky has a whole response on explaining why gelatin is permissible. Then at the end, he says, but we can't permit it. Even though it's permissible, we can't permit it because it's going to lead to people thinking, since here in England, we've been accustomed to thinking it's forbidden, now we tell them it's permitted, they're going to Jewish law can change, and this will strengthen the non-Orthodox forces. This is his evaluation. This is not Jewish law per se. Zakheim actually quotes Abramsky's response to permit gelatin. So here we have a conscious subjectivity, how he thinks the ruling is going to play in the community. And we see this again and again. This is what I call meta factors. There's an interesting book here. It's called Letters of Rav Soloveitchik. And he was asked in the 1950s about Orthodox Jews going into the army as chaplains in America. Because, they might have to violate Shabbos or something like that. And he begins his article in direct opposition to his letter, in direct opposition by saying that before I even examined this, I was prejudiced. He says that it's on pages 24 and 25. I don't need to read the whole passage, but he says that I undertook this investigation in a subjective mood. I was prejudiced in favor of the project from the outset. He tells you that from the beginning, it was incomprehensible to him that anyone could rule that an Orthodox Jew couldn't be a chaplain for all the good that does. And then he explains that what I did then was trying to use this vague intuitive feeling, take this vague intuitive feeling into fixed terms of discursive thinking. He took his internal subjective feeling and tried to find a way to justify it. Now, this happened.
Yeah, I think we're just better off when we admit that there are a lot of things where we have our certain internal subjective feelings and then look for rational reasons to justify what we're feeling. So most humans are not nearly as rational as they believe themselves to be. Okay, let's have a look at the news here. Moody's, so the credit rating agency, says Lloyds' ethnic diversity plan is credit positive. So Moody's has described Lloyds Banking Group's program to promote more black employees to senior roles as credit positive, marking the first time that the rating agency has explicitly linked a company's stability to ethnic diversity measures. They say that Lloyds moves to improve staff diversity at all levels reduces Lloyds' exposure to social risk. Does this mean that the mob will burn down Barclays but not Lloyds because they heard about Lloyds' affirmative action program? Steve Saylor. Okay, we had Regis Philbin and Peter Green, the guitarist, both died over the weekend. So Regis Philbin gave us one of the greatest moments.
Which of these U.S. presidents appeared on the television series Laugh-In? Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford.
I'd like to call my parents right now.
Sure.
Use my lifeline, call my parents.
What are their names?
My father. I'll talk to my father.
Does he have a name? Tom.
He does have a name, yes, Tom.
All right. Our friends at AT&T will get your dad on the line, and we'll see if he can help you.
Hello?
Hello, Tom.
Yes.
Hi, Regis Philbin here from Who Wants to Be a Millionaire.
Hi.
We've got your son John with us right now. He's doing pretty well.
Good.
He's won $500,000.
Wow.
And he's going for $1 million. And he needs your help to get there.
Okay.
So he's going to come on the line, read a question, 4 possible answers. One of them is the right answer. And the next voice you hear will be John's. John, you've got 30 seconds. Starts right now.
Hi, Dad.
Hi.
I don't really need your help. I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to win the $1 million. Because the U.S. president appeared on Laugh-In as Richard Nixon. That's my final answer.
Well, my gosh. What can I say except, Debbie, you're going to Paris, and this is the final answer heard all around the world. He's won $1 million.
NBC. Beautiful downtown Burbank. Oh, hello, Governor Rockefeller. Oh, no. I don't think we could get Mr. Nixon to stand still for a socket to me.
Socket to me?
Okay, New York Times says that racial slurs are clever as long as they demean white women. This is from the New York Times news pages. Will it take a clever acronym to stop racially motivated 911 calls? San Francisco politician thinks a new bill named the Karen Act could be what it takes to get people's attention and limit potential harm. Very funny when the slurs are directed at white women. Racial slurs then are A-OK, according to the New York Times. All right, how is Antifa organized? We're being told that it's just leaderless resistance, and the mainstream media has no interest in probing that. This is what we're being fed, reading here from Steve Saylor. But most suspect this may be a con. You would expect that by now with these groups labeled alt-right or neo-Nazi. You would expect entire issues of establishment publications and websites would have elaborate tables of organization and leadership. Also, I believe that both federal and local law enforcement officers would have informants and agents working within these groups from the inside. For what reason remains the real mystery. Why aren't we getting this? Perhaps these factors. A, anarchist left ideology claims to be leaderless by design. On the street level, this isn't true, but few leaders willing to accept that label. B, the reason for is mainly the federal RICO statutes. If you claim no organization, then you can't be legally responsible for the acts of members. So it's smart if you can get away with that. I've been watching the Netflix documentary series Fear City about how the mafia is just dominating New York. It talked about in the 1970s, the mafia ran New York. Now, of course, this is typical media exaggeration for the sake of a good story. The mafia didn't run New York in the 1970s or any other decade. It dominated certain sections of the city, but there's a long way between dominating garbage collection and dominating a city. So yeah, the mafia apparently dominated garbage collection and they dominated some of the unions, but at no time did they run New York. But they were brought down by RICO, whereby it made it a lot easier to go after criminal groups. Steve Saylor notes, Southern California law enforcement agencies over the last dozen years has gotten adept at teaming up across municipal and jurisdictional boundaries to use RICO to roll up entire Black and Latino street gangs in a single day. Don't just try to arrest the gang kingpin. Arrest all 50 to 100 members of the gang in one day, ship them off to distant federal prisons. The Racketeer Influence Criminal Organization Law, RICO, Racketeer Influence Criminal Organization Law, was passed in 1970 to crack down on the Italian mafia. It took about 12 years for law enforcement to understand how to use it. But it's been used against a wide variety of organizations. Using it on Antifa seems feasible. Now, the internet and social media make isolated temporary modes of communication easier. Very changeable, spontaneous networks created on the fly voluntarily and quickly for one-time use. Law enforcement officers may prefer monitoring to repressing so long as violence is contained, plus there's less political blowback. But that might change if this Antifa violence becomes more targeted and murderous. Mainstream media, in a push to defeat Donald Trump, wants the narrative to be protesters, largely peaceful protesters, not savage mobs, dissent versus police repression. Affluent white punks run Antifa and related gangs, and they use lumpen proletariat crims as allies. This might be actual white privilege at work. Antifa is about inflicting damage on society, not stealing for gain. Mainstream media regards Antifa as the Biden militia, at least until November. Does Joe Biden have a plan to put Antifa back on ice as soon as he wins? Perhaps some reporter should ask him. Anyway, as the old commies used to say, all this hands-off MSM treatment is no accident.
And this is not criticism, it's just an observation. It's this. You start from the premise that masks are dehumanizing to wear in the COVID crisis. That's your premise. And so,
wait, forgive me. Wait, let me just say,
sure.
Any rational person knows that masks dehumanize.
Okay.
It's not an argument against it has nothing to do with whether they're effective medically. These are separate issues. I just want people, when I mention that, forgive me, it's very important to you. When I mention that they're dehumanizing, I mention that in the context of don't think no price is paid. It's like the lockdown. You might argue for it scientifically, but please do not deny the horrific price to people's lives. Suicides, addiction, closed businesses, lost savings. So there's a terrible price paid for masks.
I don't dispute that.
Okay, so that's not a confirmation bias because it's not related to the medical question. Go ahead.
Well, I would say actually that it was confirmation bias. You read an article, I think it was from the CDC.
That's correct. Yes,
in May,
that's
the
right.
other day,
yes.
And you read a line, and I think the living martyr actually caught this. Because I caught it in his voice. He seemed to be saying, "Hey, you're reading something that actually contradicts a point that you made earlier in the situation." So,
he doesn't remember the line, and I don't remember the line. Let me just react though, only because I have to take a lot of calls, or as many as possible. I try to work against confirmation bias. I challenge my views in my mind. I have my whole life. That is the reason that I'm an effective proponent of what I believe, because I have a book in 5 volumes, and it'll be out next year. And there are 4 of us who read the entire commentary aloud. We spend a week together, and that is my wife, the editor, Rabbi Joseph Talishkin, and Joel Alperson, who is sort of the conductor of the whole orchestra. And you should hear the arguments. I mean, these are 4 people with identical values, or virtually identical values. And we sometimes get into yelling arguments about the commentary. So that's precisely because I don't want confirmation bias. But anyway, it is what it is. Thank you. And Joe in Asbury Park, New Jersey. Hello.
Hello, Dennis. How are you today?
I'm
It's
good.
great to hear from you, and you are definitely home, Dennis. Hope all is well. Dennis, the reason why I picked up the phone, we're talking about transparency, and I will tell you, suppressing your values is a very empty feeling. And I recall in 2009, and I can never forget that year. It was the year, of course, it was Barack Obama's first year in office as president. And I remember the summer of 2009 and going to the 9/12 march, and it awoke me as an American and as an individual. Because for many years I wanted to be more transparent about faith, family, being pro-life, loving the law.
Okay, hold on. I want to hear the rest of the moment.
The Dennis Prager Show.
Okay.
Okay, here's a guy in talking about Google, Facebook, lack of diversity, and the guy in the video
built on emotion, rage, discussion on the whole Black Lives Matter movement, and give you my thoughts on this. I've done some thinking about this, and I've come to the conclusion that this isn't about logic. It's not about equality. It's not about a debate. People don't really want a rational discussion. Nobody's out there really discussing any of the issues. People are just out there fueled on emotion, rage, general discontent, frustration at society. And a lot of people I think out there are desperate at a time like this, either because the economy is pretty trash right now, people are losing their jobs, or they're just going stir crazy from being cooped up at home all the time. And people want stuff. People want privilege. And that's really the only means of survival that they have. And you just start blaming other people for your position. And you just take on the victim mentality, the victim mindset. And you start saying, it's because I was born in this way. It's because you're being racist against me. It's because people are not being fair to me. And you just start blaming everybody else out there and saying, the world owes me something. Because if you think about it, really, there are so many other minorities out there that have been discriminated against, right? For example, Middle Eastern people, Native Americans, they're probably being discriminated even more so than black people. In fact, if you take a look at black people, they have it pretty good when you consider we've had a black president. In the NBA, it's all black people. We have these huge blockbuster movies like Black Panther, which are entirely black casts of people. You've got black people represented in movies, music. Almost every single big Hollywood movie has several black people in there. And then when you take a look at, well, where are the Asian people in these places? Where are the Native Americans, Indians, Middle Eastern, Italians, Filipinos, and all the other types of people who compose up of America? Where are they? And I know that you can say, well, black people have been slavery in the US. Well, you take a look at these other races, like take a look at Japanese people. They were war prisoners in the US. They have probably been treated even worse. And some of these other countries, they have their own histories in which these immigrants who are now part of the US, those people suffered too. I believe that every generation should start fresh, right? I don't want my children to have to pay for the crimes of my ancestors. That was the past, let it be. And you can't really just go back and say, hey, remember 50 years ago, 100 years ago, this thing happened? Well, now I want your children to pay for that, which happened to my grandfather.
Okay, we've got Dooovid here joining the show. Dooovid, do you have something you want to start with?
Yeah, if you could see clearly, I wanted to show, I pulled off my shelf. Sorry, it's heavy. Take the earpiece out. My complete collected writings of, I'm sorry, my earpiece fell out because this is heavy. And just to show you how much I love Judaism, I paid like $160 for this. And actually, it's out of print. I was surprised. I looked online and it's going for like $400 now. But that's the complete collected writings of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. And why I mentioned it is because you've been sending me these articles and we've been talking about the Jewish view towards history. And I think your Rabbi Hirsch is probably about as far left wing in orthodoxy towards secular studies and history. And a lot of like the yeshiva university stuff is largely based off of Rabbi Hirsch. And interesting, Gatz, who wrote the famous like multi-volume history of the Jewish people, had been a student of Rabbi Hirsch, and he had tried to convince him to become Orthodox. And I didn't take the book off the shelf, but it's actually free online. The Sepharia, the 19 letters, which is like a hypothetical letters that a young rabbinic student sends Rabbi Hirsch. And he tries to argue like against reform and against all of these various things. And he stretches the limit of orthodoxy in terms of what he believed, Torah Mata, which largely grew into modern orthodoxy. There's different history in Hungary. I have on my YouTube channel Professor Howard Lupovich. He's written a few books. He's the head of the Judaic Studies at Wayne State University, the big one in Detroit, and he's Columbia alumni. And he specializes in the history, like reform in Hungary. But I thought that it was a precursor for a lot of the stuff that we were talking about with one thing, just looking at how do Jews view history. And if you wanted to talk about, I thought me and Luke, ironically, according to Orthodoxy, are really kind of the only people who are really supposed to talk about this stuff.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, I was a Baal Tshuva, and I ended up in very Orthodox circles, Haredi, Hasidic circles. And they wouldn't use the term like dispensation, and they call it like a heter or tikkun, but to say, because of my lineage, I have, special things to do for the Jewish people that are not applicable to other people, largely because they're not good for regular, Orthodox Jews to do. And one of those things is to too deeply delve into these issues. Like obviously the sages or a select few rabbi scholars, but generally in yeshivas, most people are discouraged from these type of studies or even historicity. If you're in New York, there's the huge debates on just having secular education, even in grade schools, let alone as part of rabbinic training. But this perspective that the law applies differently to me and Luke because of our non-Jewish blood, which is pretty politically incorrect. But as you get further and further into Orthodox circles, I think it would make more and more sense to people besides the rabbis. So like if me or Luke walked into a black hat place and we're behaving differently than other people in a way that was unacceptable for one of them to behave, and they're like, oh, he's a convert or like he's a half Jew, that would somewhat like, oh, explain, like, oh, that makes sense then. And in terms of certain things, that would mean like talking about these issues. How come you don't find Orthodox Jews trying to join in on this? Even, Rabbi Shapiro probably wouldn't talk to us, or, Valley Beit Medrash, or these various people that are training rabbis and have to deal with this stuff. But generally, I think these conversations are largely frowned upon, maybe not forbidden, but if they're not forbidden in pure Orthodoxy, they have to be done under very simple guidelines. So someone like Rabbi Shapiro, God forbid, is an extremely controversial figure because, so to say, he's a proper Jew. And so, it's questionable, like, who is this man? Why is he doing it? As opposed to, Dooovid or Luke, to an Orthodox Jew, which is like, well, because he's a part non-Jew, that's why he's doing this. And the rules apply to him differently. So, that would say like me and Luke could probably walk into most Orthodox places, even though we're on live stream and talking about this stuff openly. And your average Orthodox Jew would probably, so to say, these guys have some sort of special dispensation heter, as opposed to Rabbi Shapiro, like he might be, screamed out of the Orthodox place. He would actually be more likely to be kicked out in an Orthodox place than me or Luke.
Yeah, maybe that's a fascinating topic. I don't believe he's ever been screamed at or kicked out of a place, but this touches on much broader issues that in general in life and with this show, you can get away with a lot more if you keep the tone elevated so that you're, say, for example, only speaking to people with an average IQ over 120. So a lot of academics who write on controversial issues, they make sure to do so in such an abstruse way that only people who have IQs over 145 can understand them. Therefore, you considerably reduce your social anxieties. You reduce the blowback because ordinary people can't understand. So Mark Shapiro, he pitches all his work at a very high IQ crowd, from his books to his podcasts and to his videos. They're all aimed at a high IQ crowd. And so you can reduce a lot of negative effects, a lot of negative reactions by just elevating the quality of your discourse so that ordinary people can't understand it. Also, everybody in Orthodox Judaism is expected to have a Rav, someone that they consult with on halakhic issues, meaning issues of Jewish law. And so it's a Rav, a good Rav, will modulate his rulings on how to observe Jewish law to the situation of the individual. So not just for converts, not just for Balei Tshuva, not just for people, say, who have half non-Jewish blood, but every Rav will take into consideration, for example, the economic position of who they're ruling for and the person's say family life, social situation, where they live. So a Rav will make very different rulings, say for a Los Angeles or a Seattle or a Portland than he would for, say, Crown Heights and Manhattan and New Jersey. So in the responsive literature, they normally indicate where a question comes from, because the halakhic rulings, the legal guidance is going to be very different depending on a person's situation, depending on a person's economics, depending upon a person's geography. Any thoughts, Dooovid?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say like Judaism is meant to live by and promote a successful community. So a rabbi will take that into consideration. Like Jews are in LA, they should be successful in LA. And as opposed to Israel, where there may not be any reasonable exceptions, such as like a beard or something like that. Because if you look into pure halakha, it's actually a pretty strict thing not to shave. However, it's not a strict thing when it comes between earning a livelihood and shaving. Almost all rabbis will say if shaving means you can't earn a livelihood, or means you even make more, have more respect or more earning power, almost all rabbis are going to tell you to go ahead and shave. But if you're in Israel and you say, well, you don't, if you're in an Orthodox community and you can't really make an argument that shaving is going to increase your earning power, it would come a thing like you can't shave. It's completely forbidden. Even though, if you had even a small exception, like, earning a livelihood. So in LA, in Jerusalem, if you walk down the street, there's signs on, doorposts and that have all the rabbi signatures, how it's absolutely forbidden to shave, and statements from the Zohar, how bad things happen to people who shave. And I would say in Jerusalem, there's not a single respected, clean shaven Orthodox rabbi. There couldn't be such a thing like in Jerusalem or Bnei Brak. However, in LA, besides the yeshiva, I would probably say almost all the respectful rabbis are probably clean shaven. And if one of those rabbis came to Jerusalem, it wouldn't surprise anybody. It's like, oh, you're from LA, even if though you're an Orthodox Jew. Just like Dooovid and Luke studying this stuff. It's like, oh, like what's up with this Dooovid and Luke talking about this stuff? It was like, oh, Doovid's a half Jew, Balchuva, and Luke's a ger, and so that would make some sort of intuitive sense, and it would show that there's not a threat to the community. That's why I say like Dooovid and Luke are not a threat to the community, because no Jew in their right mind is going to follow me or Luke. It's basically a 0% chance. As opposed to someone like Mark Shapiro is a threat to the Jewish community, and therefore, through maybe just Ashkenazic rhetoric, they have to be like, this is an evil man. And really what they're saying, they're not trying to say he's a bad, evil man. They're just saying this is dangerous. We don't want you following this guy's teaching. And it's almost from Rabbi Shapiro's perspective, because your average goy is like, who really cares? You're like, and you have to build it up like, no, this is a huge controversy. This is a really, really, really big deal. And to your average goy, be like, oh, come on. Like, I don't buy this. And I found the volume. This is, I'm not sure how much research you've done on this. I know you've been sending me links in a few of these books. Volume 5 of Rabbi Hirsch's collected writings, and it's a critical examination of Dr. Gretz's History of the Jews from destruction of the Jewish states until the conclusion of the Talmud. And I believe at that point, Gratz had been kind of like a German Jew who was looking into Judaism, becoming a rabbi, and just like Jacob Neusner, who Wolfson in the book was the head of Harvard before Tversky, and then Tversky, who replaces him, came from an Orthodox background, and Wolfson was more modern. Tversky became modern, but kind of remained Hasidic, even though he remained modern. But the tendency was to have former Orthodox people be Judaic studies heads. And said Wolfson, he knew that Neusner wanted to be a Reform rabbi, and he didn't like Reform rabbis or whatever, so he discouraged him and their relationship. But Heinrich Gretz is a similar case. As a young kid, he loves Judaism. He's very skeptical of Orthodoxy, but he even stays in the house of Rabbi Hirsch as a student for a period of time. And then eventually, years later, he writes his The History of the Jews, which is largely the first Jewish-sourced book that's a history of Jews. Most Jewish literature is kind of legends of rabbis. And even if you read Art Scroll, the difference between like Art Scroll and other books, like Art Scroll is largely legends of rabbis. And if history, academia, type stuff conflict with the legend of rabbi narrative, as a believer, you're more likely to go with the legend of rabbi. Like I said, Maimonides, for an Orthodox Jew, isn't just a great stage. He has this kind of like stamp of approval of God, so that you can't even disagree or argue with Maimonides, because it's, like you could be like tantamount to arguing with God forbid. I mean, not that far. But Hirsch like destroys his student. He goes through when we talk about Neusner, which I don't know if you want to talk about today, and how he kind of writes like hundreds of books on Jewish history. He's already like 70 years later than Gratz, and Hirsch goes through arguing on basically every single point of historicity of Gratz in kind of the defense of legends of rabbis. Like, yes, we value history. Yes, Torah Umata, but you can't use history to interpret the Talmud in a way that doesn't subscribe to our kind of like papal infallibility, a godly stamp of approval on the sages. And so from my perspective, we would argue with Luke already for a few months on, or like a month, on similar topics like evolution. But modern orthodoxy is essentially going to fail, because orthodoxy requires this like godly stamp of approval on the rabbis to the extent that you can't really go against them. And modern orthodoxy that appeals to an academic method just can't accept this godly stamp of approval on Orthodox Jews. And Luke, God forbid, the current situation of Israeli politics is a citizenship question. Like, so for me, okay, I'm a half Jew, or if you're a Jew, does it really matter? Like, the Orthodox rabbi, the modern Orthodox versus the open Orthodox. But for Luke, his status as a Jew is in question, by the state of Israel, due to which rabbis do you listen to? As a convert, and a convert is only a Jew, only as Jewish as much as the head rabbis say so. And if the head rabbis in Israel say open Orthodoxy isn't Judaism, and anyone converted through open Orthodoxy is basically, a non-citizen. It was a false citizenship. They can't give you citizenship. And now like modern, I'm sure, Luke, there's plenty of communities he could move to in Israel and have no problem. But as Israel shifts to the right, that could even be a question on someone's like citizenship, where because Luke is in this dynamic where he can't really argue with the Orthodox rabbis, because according to Orthodoxy, they have this kind of like godly stamp of approval, but at the same time, there's a lot of leniency and, so to say, wiggle room to become better Jews. That if me or Luke could pitch what we're trying to do in, trying to become better Jews, almost no one's going to have a complaint on that.
Yeah, I remember I had a friend who was going to meet with a major rabbi, and so for about a month beforehand, he stopped shaving. So normally he was fairly clean shaven for his job, but because he particularly needed the help of a major rabbi with something for about a month prior to the meeting, he stopped shaving. So I want to touch on some of the topics you mentioned. The funniest book review that I've ever read regarding a book in the Orthodox Jewish genre, Chaim Soloveitchik writes the book review. Chaim Soloveitchik is the brother of the late Joseph Ber Soloveitchik. So he's a major thinker in centrist Orthodox Judaism. He writes this book review by a student of Jacob Neusner, who's a Reform rabbi, Peter J. Haas, who wrote a book called The Literary History of a Rabbinic Genre. And the rabbinic genre is responsa literature. So responsa literature, very much like what it sounds, it's a response. So people send in questions to a rabbi to get a ruling. So Chaim Soloveitchik writes, I've read good books and I've read bad books. Now I've read a book by Peter J. Haas. I mean, that's just a fantastic way to start a book review. I mean, I've never read an opening like that. I mean, it's unprecedented. It's hilarious. I can just see someone doing a review of my videos and saying, I have seen good videos and I have seen bad videos. And now I've seen a video by Luke Ford. It has been a singular experience, and I would like to share it with others. I mean, this is not typical ways that Orthodox rabbis review books. The author, a disciple of Jacob Neusner, and currently a professor of religion at Vanderbilt University, opens with a survey of the academic study of responsa and bemoans the neglect of this important genre. Responsa, he claims, have been studied from 2 vantage points only and by a precious few scholars at that. That the responses that we have suffer from the same fatal flaw. They shared and perpetuated a conception taken over from traditional rabbinism, namely that the Jewish legal tradition is a rather stable ahistoric thing that can be comprehended altogether. The subsequent rabbinic law was simply the unfolding and ramification of the system along essentially predetermined lines. And so the author is apparently unaware of the writings of Yitzhak Ber, Solo Baran, Eliezer Bashan, H. Ben Sasson, Menachem Ben Sasson, Reuven Bonfil, and Mordechai Brewer, to mention only historians whose names begin with a B. That's a stunning sentence. It says the author is unaware of these 7 great scholars, and those are only the historians whose names begin with B. This is not to say that Peter Haas, the author, hasn't read anything. He has. Much of what he has read, not to speak of what it has enabled him to see, will come as a revelation to most scholars. He's read 1 book on the Middle Ages, Norman Cantor's Medieval History, The Life and Death of a Civilization. From Cantor's 6 pages on the revival of jurisprudence in the 12th century, Haas has been able to detect the influence of German legal scholars on the Ravaged. He has read several articles in English on rhetoric in the Middle Ages, and this has enabled him to discern Ciceronian influence on Rashi. Readers will also discover that the Jewish community of Troyes was devastated in the First Crusade, that the Ravaged succeeded his father around 1200 as chief rabbi of Berlin. All this is but a small sample of the rich surprises that await the reader. Our author might well contend that the reason he has not read much in the writings of others is that he has a different agenda, seeks to bring a new mode of analysis to bear upon the response of literature, that of communication theory. And he notes that the author did not look at Rashi, as understandable, given the difficulties that he has with understanding it. What is astonishing is that he does not even look up the Sonsino translation into English, which renders the passage accurately. Haas mistranslates and misconstrues passages that are accurately rendered in the Sonsino, then mistranslates words and phrases found in Jastro's famous Talmud dictionary. So again and again, citations are given to both rabbinic and general sources that simply do not exist. And here's a quote from the author. I found it explicitly in Rashi's comments on the Torah forbids the hire of a harlot, even if one had relations with his mother. Deuteronomy 23:19. The point, according to Rashi, is that one who brings a harlot into the temple must pay her fee, even though bringing her there was illicit to begin with. This does not contradict the Babylonian tractate, which reports Rabbi had some sheep stolen by one who broke into the house through a tunnel. Later, they wanted to return the sheep, but he would not accept them. So, here are the comments by Chaim Soloveitchik. 1. There's no such verse in Deuteronomy. Then B. Why the even? So remember, the author here has made up this verse. The Torah forbids the hire of a harlot, even if one had relations with his mother. Why the even? If the whore with whom you had intercourse happens to be your mother, does this make the offense less grave? Perhaps we are misconstruing Haas's translation. Maybe he means even one who has had relations with his mother may not hire a harlot. If this may be the intent, had anyone heretofore suggested that committing incest permits consorting with harlots, that one needs a verse or a Talmudic dictum to specifically enjoin it? There's no such statement of Rashi anywhere in the Talmud, and there's no Jewish law against paying a prostitute to go with you to the temple. It is hardly the best of company, but there's no law whatsoever against it. What does stealing sheep through a tunnel have to do with bringing prostitutes to the temple? What does this whole paragraph about sheep and whores mean? It's an agglomeration of meaningless sentences. To unravel the errors in this one brief paragraph would require us several passages. What's most striking is not simply Haas's ignorance, but also his approach. When confronted with a word or phrase or a technical term he doesn't know, our author does not turn to a Hebrew or Aramaic dictionary. He simply makes up whatever seems appropriate to him in the context with all the resultant confusion. I put the book down, not knowing whether to laugh or to cry. That the author writes as he does is understandable. He apparently doesn't know any better, but scholarly presses, one thought, had readers. So that's the devastating book review by Chaim Soloveitchik on a student of Jacob Neusner. Anything there catch your attention, Dooovid?
No, I mean, so that's kind of my point. Like, these guys really despised each other, at least, even to the extent like where you hear World War II conspiracy theories between anti-Zionist and Zionist who, like hate each other so much that they don't even blame the Nazis, they blame each other. And it reminds me of a story that I learned in yeshiva. It was kind of, to show you how well you should know the stuff. Like the new rabbi who's giving his first class, and one of his teachers comes in and asks him a question about, a difficult Rambam, a statement from Maimonides. And the rabbi says, like, I'm not familiar with that one. See me after the class. And, so after the class, the rabbi tells him, is like, I made it up. It wasn't really a Rambam. And like, you're not ready to be a rabbi yet. To be a rabbi, you don't just have to know what the Rambam says. You have to know when someone misquotes the Rambam, they're misquoting him. And so Rabbi Soloveitchik was probably, that good of a scholar. And you think like, me and Luke doing internet, like, constantly we're bombarded with people with just these misunderstandings of Judaism. And, okay, me and Luke aren't rabbis or big scholars, but, we finished the main corpus of Jewish literature that if someone comes with something ridiculous, you say like, no, like that's not in the Talmud, or like, God forbid, all these people who, troll me or want me to denounce child marriage or these rare statements. Well, I didn't even say rare statements, but these statements in the Torah about how things were in ancient time, the laws that would completely go against modern standards, like polygamy and child marriage and slavery. And there's different ways to understand that. But the point where someone's going to hit you something that's not even true, and it's supposed to be a book on Jewish scholarship. So at some point, there was a huge distance between knowledge of Hebrew and the text and the scholars. And I believe that's changed for a few reasons. One thing now, the biggest heretical scholars are actually Israeli, and they write in Hebrew, and their knowledge of Hebrew is better than the rabbis usually, because most rabbis don't pay that much attention to grammar. So your current Israeli heretical scholars usually won't make these same mistakes that conservative or reform rabbis, and also the sheer volume of stuff that's been translated. But to some extent, it's like Christopher Ben Jerknes, who is writing he's got, God forbid, this new series on like Blood Bible, basically saying the Jewish religion is about exterminating the Goyim, and he's got like all these quotes. And I debated him, and I was like, I don't think that's the actual source or quote. But maybe he does have like some like esoteric Kabbalistic text that actually says that according to translation. And, so it's interesting, that dynamic. And I think at this point, saying that there's a despise in some camp, of orthodoxy towards secular and reform. Like I said, the ban on interfaith, where just the Orthodox rabbi is even forbidden from, speaking from the same platform as a reform or conservative rabbi, that open orthodoxy had that end to move in on. And it's funny because Rabbi Soloveitchik, his scholarship isn't questioned, but like within orthodoxy, he's like the black sheep of his family, because obviously Brisk is the most famous rabbinic school and the most anti-Zionist of, besides the Hasidim. Brisk in Jerusalem used to be head of the Ada Haredi, the single most powerful anti-Zionist scholar in the world is probably, Dooovid Soloveitchik or his brother Soloveitchik, and saying those are recognized as the single largest scholars in the world in many Orthodox circles, and they're the head of anti-Zionist ruling. So it's ironic, the role of Rabbi Soloveitchik. That's right, like Stam Rebbe. When you learn the Talmud, there's a question like Stam Rebbe in the Mishnah means Reb Meir, and Stam kind of just means like general. So anytime the Mishnah says a statement Rebbe and it doesn't ascribe who, and not Rebbe Nasi, I think Omer the Rabbanim, or I have to look at the exact phrase. The Talmud says that you could assume that that's Rev Meir. So in America, Stam Rebbe usually means the Lubavitch Rebbe. If someone just like the Rebbe, I mean, they could be talking about any Rebbe, but if they just say the Rebbe, they're probably talking about the Lubavitch Rebbe. And if they just say the Rav, they're probably talking about Rav Soloveitchik. And I think that goes into also this dynamic of me and Luke as being in a special situation due to non-Jewish blood, where your average person is expected to follow the rulings of a rabbi basically on everything. And they might have a few specific issues where they might choose a different rabbi based on certain circumstance. So your average modern Orthodox person, the Stam Rav is Rav Soloveitchik or his disciple, Rev J.J. Schechter or whoever Yeshiva University is promoting. And the person probably follows the Rav in Yeshiva University's ruling on basically like high 90% of what they do. And then there might be a few certain things where whatever reason it wasn't applicable to follow the Rav's ruling, and therefore they sought other rabbis or their own understanding to do something different. As opposed to, me or Luke, even if you could count us in a school of orthodoxy, we're not going to be like, Luke isn't going to be like in the high 90% of following the rulings of Rabbi Soloveitchik. He might be like 40% following Rabbi Soloveitchik, like 30% Lubavitch, and it's going to be a mismatch that you're not going to find in a regular Orthodox Jew, although that's rising in larger community, like Jake Turks, the media guy, who's like, what kind of chassid are you? He's like, I'm just a chassid. He's like, well, what does that mean? And it kind of means like, I pick and choose. I don't have one rabbi where I follow everything. And if Luke, you want to respond to that, I also wanted to mention my ideas on COVID-19 as being preparation for the temple.
Okay, yeah, so I'm just going to respond that I observe the customs and laws of whichever Jewish community I join. So at least publicly with regard to the synagogue. So that's how I roll. Okay, Dooovid, go ahead and make your points on COVID.
So I was, I went to the local modern Orthodox synagogue, and I think the majority of people are still preferring indoor, which to me, I'm not high authoritarian where I tell people what to do, but to me, it makes more sense outdoor. And there were a handful of people outdoors. Social distancing, very difficult. Israel is really exploding now in COVID-19. Like we tried to mimic the Chinese for a few months, and I think we just couldn't do it anymore. The Israelis tried full lockdown and these things that were coming out of China. And now you see after a few months, like Jews are just like, no, we can't do it. And COVID is skyrocketing. But we can talk about that also. But I was, standing in synagogue and looking at the social distancing and everyone with masks. And I was thinking, me and Luke, we study Talmud, and we're talking about historicity of do we actually believe this stuff? But in the Talmud, huge sections, probably 30% of sections of the Talmud deal with things that have absolutely no applicability today without the temple, like tithes and temple services, and also this concept of impurity, where if you touch something that's impure, it puts a person in a state of ritual impurity, and that would limit the person's ability to participate in certain rituals, right? I mean, Luke, I'm sure you're, having studied as much Talmud as you did, you're exceedingly familiar with the Judeo Second Temple purity standards, right?
Yeah.
And so, okay, do we really think that there's going to be a red heifer and we're going to burn it and spread the ashes in order that we could re-enter the temple? And even simple things like menstrual blood is a very big taboo, next to like the impurity that comes from contact with the dead. Menstrual blood is probably the next biggest impurity, and then there's all sorts of impurities. There's just like touching insects. Some of those you could just go to the mikveh for. Some of those take more complicated, quarantine processes. A lot of scholars believe that Qumran was one of these purification places for priests. That it says in the Mishnah there were, I think, 24 different families of Kohanim, and they each served 2 weeks in the temple, and then they all like chipped in for the festivals. But generally, the way the Second Temple was supposed to be structured was that there were these 24 families of Kohanim, and they were all obligated to serve and fulfill the temple services 2 weeks a year. And a place like Qumran would have been a facility for these Kohanim to go to so that they could quarantine and, go to the mikveh and do the red heifer or whatever these things in order that they could enter a ritual state of purity to enter the temple. So I was just sitting there in synagogue and I say, okay, like obviously COVID-19 as punishment for our sins is in line with Judaism because like me and Luke have been discussing, like a vengeful God is not out of the belief structure of Judeo theology. So like COVID-19, like if rabbis could say, God forbid, the Holocaust was punishment for our sins, certainly they're going to be able to say that COVID-19 is punishment for our sins. But a lot of times, like the curses in the Torah, there's an upside to the punishment. And like the commentators in Deuteronomy, maybe in a few weeks, if me and Luke are still doing this, we could examine a few, but there's like, 40 or like a long list of curses. But within each of the curses is like this little hidden bonus of even if we sin and get the curse, that there's going to be some positive takeaway from going through the experience. And God forbid, if you think like, okay, the state of Israel came out of the Holocaust, God forbid. So I was looking at COVID-19 and saying, okay, me and Luke have been studying Talmud for most of our adult lives. And we're pretty familiar with these concepts of ritual purity and that it's really not applicable unless the temple gets rebuilt in our lifetime. And then the nature of COVID-19 and staying safe, wearing masks, social distancing, not touching your face, and all these things, which is related to the purity standards that are laid out in the Talmud that are basically completely inapplicable in modern day Judaism. So I was thinking of that, like, God forbid, COVID-19 is almost certainly a punishment of our sins. And most of the sages would say something like Lashon Hara or bad languages because it comes from, it comes from people's mouth. But the upshot of it could be that it's going to teach the world about purity. And for, the ongoing last few weeks of what me and Luke have been, discussing, debating, is this, does it work? Do we really believe? And from a belief system, you can't just rebuild the temple and go there because we're in a state of ritual impurity. So even if the temple were rebuilt, we would have to go through this ritual purification process in order to be able to enter the temple. And maybe, God forbid, we could learn that lesson from COVID-19.
Okay, thanks, Dooovid. So the way that Jews use this teaching, maybe XYZ is punishment for our sins, it's not to beat yourselves down in an unproductive fashion. So there's a lot of talk about Jewish guilt, but I've never seen a Jew who's like tormented by his burden of sins. It's far more of a Christian phenomenon. So for example, I'll just give you an example of how I've used this teaching of like punishment for sin. One morning I stayed in bed instead of getting up early to go to synagogue. And because I stayed in bed, I came out and I'd gotten a parking ticket that I'd forgotten that the street sweeper was coming by that morning. So I used that occasion of getting a parking ticket as like, this is God sending me a reminder that I should get up early in the morning, go to Minyan and to Daf Yomi. So that's a productive way of using some unpleasant news. I didn't beat myself down over it. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Rabbi Jacob Neusner. When I was early on in my journey towards Judaism, circa 1992, my father, who's an evangelical Christian theologian, he would get a lot of catalogs of religious books. And so one catalog had a whole bunch of Jewish books. And so he showed it to me. And about half the books in it were written by Jacob Neusner. So this guy, who's an ordained conservative rabbi, grew up a Reform Jew, and then turned back to Reform Judaism in his old age. He published or edited about 1,000 books, meaning he was putting out a book during, say, from age 30 to age 60. He was writing a book about every 2 weeks, and just amazing levels of productivity. So he'd get up in the morning, and he had a background in journalism. So his father was a publisher. So Jacob Neusner had a background in journalism. So he would compose in his head during the day. Then he'd get up in the morning to clear his schedule, and just for 3 or 4 hours, he would just write. Then he'd take a break, and he would schedule his teaching classes for the afternoon for when he was tired. So he'd use his most productive time of the day to write. So Jacob Neusner died in 2016. So I remember I was talking to a rabbi circa 1993, and who'd done a lot of graduate study and mentioned he'd studied under Jacob Neusner. And I thought, wow, that guy, he's published so many books, and the rabbi just exploded. Like, he's the most evil man I ever met. When I decided I wanted to transfer away from his university, he said that he would destroy me, and he was an incredibly difficult person, Jacob Neusner. So I just read a biography about him, and Shaul Magid writes for Tabloid magazine, sad irony about Jacob Neusner is he's one of the most influential voices in American Jewish intellectual life in the past half century, yet outside of the academy, and more specifically outside of the academic study of Judaism, while many people know his name, fewer are familiar with his work. He is best known for his irascible, nasty, and pugnacious personality, his famous excoriating reviews, sometimes book-length critiques, and his fallings out with almost every institution he has worked in. Neusner published one book, and the title was something like The Blunder of Christine Hayes, the Yale Bible and Rabbinic scholar that I've often referenced on this show. He was just constantly in conflict. He was about the only academic who kept a lawyer on retainer. He sued institutions he worked for. He sued individuals who attacked his work. And he was often given the advice that he should read more and study less. From the age of 12 on, Neusner wanted to be a rabbi. And he pioneered secular academic studies of Judaism in the United States. So, as opposed to the traditional approach to Jewish text, where you would see it all occurring as part of one homogeneous stream, the academic secular scholarship is to look at each unit as a self-contained periscope, so to speak, a self-contained section, and ask three basic questions: who wrote this, when was it written, for whom was it written? And that was the approach that Neusner would take to his text. Essentially, he would use the higher criticism, asking those three questions, and apply it to rabbinic texts such as the Talmud. He went into Harvard in 1950 as an undergraduate. He was a straight-A student throughout his life. And I've made some notes here. Among the friends he made at Harvard was the novelist John Updike. So a non-Jewish friend of mine was dating, I think, Jacob Neusner's daughter. And one day my friend came to the house, and John Updike was sitting there. And John Updike asked him, have you screwed her yet? So John Updike was a very earthy character. Neusner considered himself a Democrat through the 1960s, but because of affirmative action, primarily, he switched to become a Republican. There's a famous statement here: theology is created in Germany, corrected in England, and corrupted in America. So my father would say, when my father switched colleges, teaching it from Avondale College in Australia to Pacific Union College in the United States, he had to cut the homework that he gave his kids in half, that he gave his college students in half when he came to America. My father would say that American religion is a mile wide and an inch deep. So yes, Jacob Neusner had a regular column in Chronicles magazine, the publication of the paleo-conservatives. Got a few more notes here. Okay, let me just pause. Dooovid, you had a point you wanted to make.
Yeah, I wanted to, I meant this point a few shows back, and just, mentioning Neusner, and it's going to be related. Like, my mother always, after I got back from yeshiva and spent all this time studying Torah, and I kind of originally I thought I wanted to be a rabbi, which I don't really want to be a rabbi. And my mother, recommended me to get certification, and so yeah, but I can't really be an Orthodox rabbi. So it's get conservative reform, and that never appealed to me, especially after being in Israel and realizing how much Orthodox Jews really don't like those guys. And so you see that in Neusner, and I think what I was going to mention already yesterday will make sense of this Neusner light, and that is the role of scholarship in Judaism versus the role of power brokerage, and where you have certain rabbis that have a power of largely influencing the state to do good things for the Jews or fundraising. And generally, both of those things trump and are more important than scholarship, except within the Torah world of people who you really are interested in learning. And even in that world, people will recognize the huge importance of power broking rabbis that are capable of raising large sums of money or capable of interceding with the state on behalf of the Jewish community, or even like other communities, interfaith or African American community, of various things. And so because the secular, reform, conservative weren't really movements of scholarship, you might have had a handful of rabbinic trainers who really studied these books and really cared about it, maybe like Neusner. But generally, like reform and conservative Judaism, it's social action, it's power brokerage, and because there's not that many pews filled, and the people in the pews aren't really looking for new scholarship on Judaism. They're looking for their rabbis to be able to intercede with leaders of the government on our behalf, or they're looking for the fundraising communal opportunity. So you find people in those power brokerage careers that are really extremely unpleasant people, and it's kind of part of the job. So it's not surprising. I don't know, like God forbid, like Malcolm Hoenlein or something, a famous name. It's probably like a nice, good guy, but if you saw that guy like being harsh or yelling or something, it wouldn't be surprising, because it's like that's his job. That's what he does. He meets with agitated non-Jews and various things, or any of these people. And so a lot of your Reform, conservative, even Orthodox world, you would expect this value of humility that's important for pulpit rabbis or leaders within the Jewish community. Like, oh, he's humble, he's almost like a saintly type person. But the reality is that you don't have saintly people that are successful power brokers. So you always have that dynamic of power brokers that do things for the community, even though they don't displace saintly power, versus the people within the community who are scholars that display kind of the saintly levels of humility.
Yeah, this is good points there, Dooovid, because Orthodox Jews only make up about 15% of American Jews, but they comprise a majority of those Jews who perform the commandments, perform the mitzvot, and study Torah. So Orthodox Jews overwhelmingly do most of the Torah study and most of the Jewish activities, and have the highest levels of Jewish commitment. So the rabbis you hear about most often in the news media, overwhelmingly they tend to have the least influence over those Jews who actually take Judaism seriously. Those Jews who take Judaism seriously and sacrifice for it and devote their lives to it are the least likely to show up in the news media. Here is a brief clip of Jacob Neusner appearing on a firing line with William F. Buckley and Michael Kinsley back in 1993.
I don't need a minute and a half. I have 2 points to make. First of all,
this is how you write your book so fast.
there has been enormous exaggeration, both here and elsewhere, on the numbers and the strength of the Christian right and the religious right in general. Andrew Greeley has just done a study, and I'll spare you the numbers, but he's very good at number crunching. And his number is about 5% of the population. Apologies, Dr. Robertson, but that's the number that he comes up with on well-defined criteria. My second point, we cannot confuse the separation of church and state, which I think nearly all Americans support, and for the reasons that you say, Mr. Lynn. That is, the strength of religion in this country has derived from its being free of politics. So to separate church and state is not something that the religious right wants to end. It's something, as Dr. Robertson says, we would like to realize in another medium. And that has to do with the impossibility of separating political conviction from religious conviction. Nothing that I've heard from Dr. Robertson or any other of the Christian right has suggested that they want to tell me to adopt their religion, even to eat lobster, which I kind of miss. What? Oh, that's it? That was 90 minutes?
You don't have to leave.
Okay.
You have a question, Ms. Woods?
Okay, let me play another brief video here on Jacob Neusner. This is by the Christian Gary North.
In every field, there is a supreme master in every generation. The general public probably has not heard of him. But within the circle of masters, all will acknowledge one person as the supreme master once they see the evidence. In the field of nonfiction book writing, the supreme master of output is a man who calls himself Jack Neusner. This is not how he is known to the academic community. He is known as Jacob Neusner. He is a rabbi. He is an academic scholar, and he was for decades a college professor. What you are about to see appears to be impossible. If there were no public record of it, no one would believe it, especially not an academician. I point out 4 facts. First, the earliest book is dated 1962. That is 50 years before this video. Second, each dot or bullet represents a book. It is not an article or a book review. Neusner has written many of these. I am not sure if anyone knows how many. Third, book publishers have published these books. They were not self-published. A buyer was expected to pay for each book. Enough buyers bought so that publishers kept publishing. Fourth, the list ends in early 2005. That was over 7 years ago. He has continued to write. Go to Google, search for Jacob Neusner, books, and Amazon. Do this year by year, 2006, 2007, and so forth. See what you find. With this in mind, let us begin.
I was just scrolling through all the titles of Jacob Neusner's approximately 1,000 books. Publishing outlook, unlike
As reported
anything.
in Time magazine in 2008, the total as of 2008 was 950 books written or edited by Neusner. That is 20 books a year, but he has continued to write since 2008. In a round number, this is a grand total of about 1,000 books. That is one book every 2.5 weeks for 50 years. Every 2.5 weeks, he completes a manuscript and corrects the page proofs of any previous book. I want to believe that he does not index them personally. He has raised the bar, as high jumpers say. Want to try to raise it higher? I don't recommend it.
So that's Gary North, who's a Christian and an economist and a prolific author in his own stead. But nobody can touch the productivity of Jacob Neusner. A few more points here I wanted to make on Neusner. He said of the historian Salo Baron that he contributed nothing, being himself intellectually vacuous. He made his books by paraphrasing sources he never troubled to criticize, by paraphrasing the opinions of other scholars he never fully understood. Many of Jacob Neusner's works were read and celebrated in non-Jewish contexts, particularly in Europe, even as they were simultaneously overlooked or criticized or ignored in specifically Jewish contexts, such as in Israel. When Jacob Neusner put in a request with the 1960s version of interlibrary loan, I never forget how exciting it was to learn about interlibrary loan, where you could get books brought in from other libraries to your local branch. A truck that ran weekly to the well-stocked Madison Library to bring back 25 to 50 volumes a week. He was refused. The reason that the director gave was that Neusner could not possibly read so many books in a week. So my father and I would check out so many books from interlibrary loan that we ended up being charged $1 per book. Jacob Neusner was a master of taking larger issues and framing them in simple terms for all to understand. He was an important public intellectual in the national Jewish media. He'd spend his life writing for newspapers and magazines, because having worked as a journalist since he was an adolescent, he realized how to get his point across, not just in the academy, but also among the general reading public. So my father wanted me to learn how to touch type. So starting in 2nd or 3rd grade, he would assign me to read about 40 pages of Christian apologetics and then type a 1-page summary. And that's how I learned to touch type. Okay, Dooovid, any comments you want to make?
Yeah, I guess, from the Orthodox perspective, like the irony that, most Jews have forgotten Neusner, maybe like Christians who've read his literature, and the Jews who are probably in charge of canonizing our history will probably record Neusner as in a negative light. Definitely within Orthodoxy and the conservative or secular scholars will probably ditch him also. So from the Orthodox perspective, it's kind of like, okay, Neusner was a great mind and could have been great, but because of his own fallacy of just not listening to Wolfson and going to yeshiva and trying all this nonsense, he'll be relegated to the trash bin of history, which ties into this greater like Chabad or Kabbalistic perspective of I showed Brundle the first time. If you look at Judaism as concentric circles, and your inner base is your Orthodox Jews that keep all the halakha without any exception. You might not like to call them the Haredim because maybe the Haredim don't really do what they're portrayed to do, but some inner circle where the people are 100% halakhically Jewish and keep the law, to the outside circles where you have people like alt-right Mike or something, people that have a tiny bit of Jewish blood, an almost no relationship to Jewish law. And from the Orthodox perspective, the influence largely goes from inside out. You can't really have influence from outside in. So if you're on the outside, you can't have positive influence within the Orthodox world, but you could do things for the Orthodox world, such as taking upon our enemies and raising money or something like that. So, it's like, like there's a Jewish event and it's like, oh man, that guy Luke is there, but like all the millionaires like him and they donate a lot of money to our charity, so we'll pretend to be nice or something like that. What might be a common thing, and because money and power is always a trump. It's even brought down in Jewish law that you're required to respect wealthy people, and then just seeing that clip of Neusner where he's kind of like arguing with anti-Semites. So to say like no Orthodox Jew is ever going to pick up a Neusner book and find anything of value to it, but maybe Neusner could be redeemed because because at the bottom of his heart, like Neusner wasn't really a heretic and he didn't really believe what he was doing, and he only did it because he wanted to help out the Jewish people and help us survive and thrive. And it's kind of like a God forbid, like an Eric Stryker or Kevin McDonald type argument that corresponds to Hasidism or something like that, where Chabad could be like, well, Neusner, he did a lot of bad things and he got punished for them within Judaism. Like, God forbid, nobody's surprised his daughter, marries a non-Jew or something like that. Of course, Neusner's, daughter's going to marry a non-Jew. Would anyone surprised at all? But like, he might be able to be revived in terms of a Jewish understanding for his levels of fighting anti-Semitism. That's why I even put Shapiro in that category, and me and Luke. Like, no Orthodox person is going to be, going to brag about how much Torah they learned from me and Luke. However, they might commend us in Orthodox circles as a champion defender of the Jewish people against, anti-Semites or for our fundraising capabilities.
Okay, I'm going to play a few more clips.
I'll stimulate a few questions. Does anyone want to start? Mr. Neusner, you want to defend your sister?
When the right takes positions in politics that flow from its religious values, you find that objectionable.
It's unpersuasive.
Unpersuasive. Do you find it equally objectionable that when the opposition to the war in Vietnam took shape in the middle 60s, Dr. King framed the opposition on grounds of Christianity, and Rabbi Heschel framed the opposition on grounds of Judaism? Did they represent something that we of the right should have feared on religious grounds, or were they expressive? Well, I'll leave you the rest.
No, not at all, because on the one hand, certainly we have to bring...
Barry Lynn, we haven't heard anything from Mr. Neusner for a while.
You won't now either, because I have nothing to argue with him about, because he's talking separation of church and state, which I agree with. I think everyone at this table agrees with on this side.
It doesn't sound that way to me from that side of the table.
Because you're making distinctions which transcend separation of church and state and ask for the division between a person's religious conviction and his or her participation in public life. And I don't think that's possible. What do you think?
What I think is that there are a broad range of issues about which people...
certain kinds of Christians in mind in this regard, right? So that the claim here is simply that to confine it solely to Christians and Jews in such a heterogeneous society, pluralistic society, reflects a very truncated imagination as well as a very myopic sense of what and who could contribute to the best welfare of this nation.
But faithful Christians and faithful Jews are here too.
Of course, and they have and will continue to make contributions, but to think that somehow they would have a monopoly on contributing to the welfare of this complex nation reflects, I think, a very limited view of what is possible.
And I take the view that the party that wins defines its tests of office in terms of conviction and policy and so on, and not in terms of things about ourselves that we can't change.
Sure. Okay. I mean, one has to accept that, but I mean, keep in mind, I come from a tradition in which I've had to accept the fact that it would be white men or white women, for the most part, that be confined to elite positions for 188 years, right?
And I assure you, for most of the history of this country, into my lifetime, Jews could not get elected to the Senate either, among other things that they couldn't do.
That's true.
Everybody has gripes and everybody has complaints, and I don't think that any one group has a greater sense of control of shame over any other group.
Some groups have a heavier gravity of degradation than others in the United States.
Let me ask you an easy question, if I may. There's a lot of talk here about the danger of the religious right, okay? And I'd like to ask you to tell me, how do you want us to conduct ourselves in politics in a way, let us say, different from the way we now do?
Well, as I noted, because I think Reagan's policies were racist and effective consequences to the degree to which people of color were disproportionately disadvantaged given those policies. I'm not saying that Reagan was a racist or Pat Robertson was a racist. He knows in his own heart what is the case. I'm being charitable. I say, my God, and motivation and intention. I don't call that any question.
Professor West, ask a question of Rabbi Neusner.
Feel free.
No, but I want to ask you a question, because I think it was very disturbing when you mentioned your sister again. Do you see the anti-Semitic potential within the religious right? The conception of Jews as Christ's killers, as transgressors of deity, and so forth and so on?
We know the history of the Christian right in America has been profoundly anti-Semitic, as well as racist and patriarchal. But what does it feel like to be part of a religious right in which its history has been so viciously anti-Semitic?
We have found in the religious right friends for things that concern us very deeply. We have not found in the bulk of the religious right, I will grant you, we have our kooks. You have your kooks. I don't want to trade my kooks for your kooks.
Wait, is Pat Robertson a kook? Is Pat Buchanan a kook? I mean, I want to know
your answer to that
how
question,
central the
Rabbi
kooks are to the movement here.
The problem is not the fringe of the one side or the fringe of the other. And both sides have fringes, as we both recognize. That you are asking me to declare the religious right anti-Semitic. I don't see any evidence that would permit anyone to draw such a conclusion out of the right that's represented in this room. Not the National Review, not the causes that Congressman Hyde has worked for, and not Dr. Robertson.
Was it Jerry Falwell who said that he was unsure whether God hears the prayers of a Jew?
No, it wouldn't be Smith.
Who was that?
Willie Smith.
He's a kook.
You want more?
Is he a kook? The person who said that?
It is certainly not beyond another religion's right to take the view that God hears this one's prayers or that one's prayers. People do hold these positions. Religions think they're right. I think my religion is true and right. Religions believe that God has manifested what God wants to this group and not to others. That's perfectly natural, as you, as a professor of religious studies, know full well. What are you asking me?
But the difference between prophetic religion as opposed to an excessively dogmatic religion is an openness to ambiguity and complexity, and therefore it promotes a tolerance and a mutual respect. When I hear anyone saying that one particular religion has a monopoly on truth without being open to and listening to the insights of other religious traditions, I hear dogmatism of an excessive sort. That's dangerous for a democratic society.
What's the dogmatism that isn't excessive?
The dogmatism that isn't excessive is an acknowledgement that one stands on one's own tradition, but is self-critical, and therefore acknowledges a self-corrective mechanism built into that tradition.
What has this got to do with people on... That's it?
That's a rhetorical question you were in the middle of. Thank you very much. Thank you very
Okay, I mean, Cornel West is absurd. Okay, Dooovid, you had some thoughts.
Well, it's almost ironic because like Cornel West is more popular, is extremely popular now among Jews, like Bernie Sanders. If like his, it was in Michigan, Flint, where he gave this huge endorsement that didn't work, as the Southern blacks just didn't. It's a different kind of black man, Cornel West, than the Biden supporters in the South. But yeah, it's interesting to see Neusner with Cornel West, and obviously West, is a high IQ Harvard guy, and you could see a lot of like the Kevin McDonald, Eric Stryker stuff going on. I put a few notes in the chat, and the question is, Orthodox Jews don't really represent themselves to the Goyim. There is no phenomenon, and that's why I was telling Luke, like we could build possibly, like if there's interest, we're not going to have Orthodox competition because Orthodox Jews just don't do this. Like said, there's even the ruling that forbids them doing that. And you have guys like Rabbi Boteach, who was officially excommunicated from Chabad to some level, who does this type thing. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, might do something like this, but he's got a special dispensation. It's not like, your average rabbi can't copy what Jonathan, he's Sir Jonathan Sachs and was appointed by the Queen. And that would be looked on from the Orthodox community as like, there's just one guy who does that for the whole community. And we're not looking for like a whole bunch of more rabbis. And it makes this interesting dynamic that like I said, from an Orthodox perspective, basically, me, Luke, all secular Jews are basically mouthpieces to the Goyim from like a theological level, that the Haredim, who don't have any dealings with the Goyim, who just do the ritual and keep the law, that's the single most important thing that could conceivably be done. And that's ultimately what causes all this influence to emanate from it. And, like the greater body of the Jewish people, where me and Luke might be just on the periphery of the Orthodox circles, to people like Neusner or secular Jews that are far away with it, say like it's told Adam Green, like even from the Orthodox perspective, my message is basically to the Goyim. So like your average Chabad rabbi, Orthodox rabbi, would largely agree that like my message is largely for the Goyim. Luke's message is largely for the Goyim, and internally within Jewish circles, they have their own way of dealing with it. But that also leaves a part for the global Jewish picture, that there's a part for me and Luke, or even Neusner, where it's like, what Orthodox rabbi would want to debate Cornel West? But at the same time, that stuff's important, and that stuff helps keep the Jewish community prosperous and safe in America. So you have to have some theological grounds for like a good and bad perspective, where you're like, Neusner was a deeply flawed person who never took the halacha or orthodoxy seriously, never refined or corrected his character, but he was a great scholar and warrior for the Jewish people. And he opened a lot of doors, so to say that now there's a lot more pro-Jewish stuff happening at Harvard and these various things. So Neusner, even, like Luke Ford himself, saying he opened a lot of doors for Orthodox people, where Orthodox people before, Luke Ford and his escapades weren't able to go. But now, due to, thank God, due to Luke Ford and his escapades, Orthodox Jews are safe to, go where no Orthodox Jew has gone before. And so I think you have a long history within Judaism. Like, we send guys like Neusner out, and those guys eventually crash and burn and get replaced by proper Orthodox Jews.
Yeah. All right. So let me move on here. I've got some more notes on Jacob Neusner. So he said one could not be intellectually responsible studying Jews if they were a people apart, existing in isolation from non-Jews. Neusner refused to make the Jews special or chosen. To him, Jews represented but one social group, trying to make sense of their immediate situation in light of a host of ideas and textual strategies developed in relation to other social groups. Neusner's relationship to Isaac Tversky, who was Mark Shapiro's PhD supervisor, and Tversky was Harry Wolfson's successor at Harvard in the Litauer chair, was not nearly as productive. Neusner recalled that when, after finishing his dissertation at Columbia University, he asked Tversky what he should do next. Tversky's reply was that Neusner should begin studying Torah. He thought that Neusner, who was studying the Persian framework of the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud at the time, was wasting his time. So Neusner would study the economic and social geographic context under which the rabbinic texts developed. Neusner met his future wife Suzanne when she was his student at Camp Ramah. He taught a class on the biblical book of Jeremiah, and Suzanne took the class, and that's how they met, though they didn't begin dating until about 8 years, or till about 5 years later. So her father read something that Jacob Neusner published in a Jewish newspaper and telephoned him to ask if he was married yet. He replied he was not, so Max gave Suzanne his phone number and told her that she would like to hear from him. So Neusner telephoned her. 2 months later, they were engaged. So Neusner explained his daily routine. I get up around 4:30 a.m. I'm at my desk a half hour later. I find the morning hours the best for composing new thoughts. Later in the day, I can read or write essays or whatever, but my most original and taxing and rigorous thought takes place before sunrise. So my father had the same attitude. He in graduate school developed the habit of rising at about 3 a.m. and then working on his thesis, and he found that he could do his most original, taxing, rigorous work before sunrise, and then after breakfast he would go to his university classes. Neusner said he generally falls asleep by 9 p.m. and if something's on my mind, if I'm thinking about some problem, it will occupy my sleep, and by the hour I wake up, I will be meditating on that. When I get up, the paragraph or chapter is then pretty much written out in my head, and I only have to transcribe it. His graduate students noted that you could only call him at 8 a.m. He would budget 15 minutes for phone calls between 8 a.m. and 8:15, and he would teach only in the afternoons because that's when he was tired. Jacob Neusner took an interest in virtually all aspects of his students' lives. Many found him incredibly intrusive. He would talk to them about how they dressed for class. He would give them wake-up calls every morning so he knew that they were up and working. He became a father figure for better and for worse to his students. When he left Brown University, he would often expatiate in the prefaces to his new books about how bad his working conditions were at Brown, even though in the prefaces to his earlier books, he would talk about how good his conditions were. And he would often say his new conditions at the University of South Florida were the best he ever enjoyed. Neusner says that scholarship is always an act of choice, of selection and focus, rather than an exercise in interpreting timeless meanings in texts or symbols that are assumed to exist in a vacuum. So Neusner would focus on the social construction of religion without making appeals to God. So he was interested not in the origins of religion or even the origins of Judaism, but in how the chaotic social situation created by the destruction of the Second Temple in year 70 of the Common Era led to a series of conditions that ultimately produced a set of documents tried to make sense of life in the absence of that temple. Those documents became the Talmud. Neusner said, and what if we no longer assumed the inerrancy, that means no mistakes, of the oral Torah's writings? In Jerusalem, they say we are required to accept as historical fact whatever the rabbinic stories say, unless we have a reason to reject it. Tel Aviv, they maintain that attributions are sacrosanct, arguing if it were not true, why should the sages have assigned a saying to a given authority? At Bar Ilan University, which is an Orthodox university, professors have been known to argue with a perfectly straight face. You really think our holy rabbis would lie? So the proposed premise set forth in my, meaning Neusner's rubric, should be regarded as revolutionary, even though in all other fields of humanistic learning it has lost all novelty. Neusner said the scandal of the Jewish college student is that he is not perceptibly different from his Gentile friends and colleagues. American Jewry has en masse decided that being Jewish will not be a very different experience for the Jew from what being a Methodist is for the Methodist. The result is that the Jewish student studies a little, drinks as much, and finds no easier the sexuality and personality adjustments required of him than his non-Jewish classmates. Okay, Dooovid, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I wanted to mention a quick Chaim story that might encapsulate it in kind of these problems that Neusner and maybe people like Shapiro have. And I think the Chaim, the Rabbi Kagan who wrote the book Chaim and the Laws of Lashon Hora, is kind of revered saintly figure who ends up in Israel. And I think he had to appear in front of court in Israel. And the judge says, "Are you this rabbi of all these miracle stories?" And either the Chofetz Chaim himself or his lawyer, kind of pushes it down. But the Chofetz Chaim lawyer says, with all due respect, do people tell such stories about you? And so Neusner and legends of rabbis really only applies to ultra-Orthodox rabbis. And from a Neusner, even Shapiro type perspective, no, unfortunately, those legends of the rabbis aren't true. We were just told these legends of the rabbi. But if you're in the ultra-Orthodox world, the sages are treated extremely well in some circumstances. Like the sage, the level of, it's almost like master-slave type thing. A rabbinic student of a rabbi, will prostrate, or we won't prostrate ourselves like bow, but we'll basically serve our rabbi like a servant and would be our honor. Because we believe in kind of these legendary status. So once you step out of this ultra-Orthodox school where you're saying like, no, I'm sorry, Jews are fundamentally a different creation than non-Jews. We have a different soul. It's a fact. And these kind of various things are like, yes, it matters whether you follow all these rituals and purity law. And once you step into the more academic approach, you're never going to be a legendary rabbi like the rabbis in the Talmud. So a guy like Neusner, who's this huge scholar, or even a guy like Shapiro, just great scholar, went to Harvard, Oxford, book reviews. Philosophically, he could never be that rabbi that legends are told about, or this rabbi that that his students ask him about their everyday activities, like who should they marry and what should they do in a day-to-day life, that you might expect a student to ask an ultra-Orthodox rabbi and say, like, and even Neusner, like marrying his student or something like that. That those type things are out of the norm within an Orthodox realm. So it just makes a interesting perspective. And I also wanted to quickly mention, it's off topic. We could
that's fine. Go ahead.
The Mary Trump, and I was listening to her interviews and all her complaints about her grandfather, and where she's kind of saying is like, no, unfortunately, my granddad was a pretty bad man. God forbid. Where I'm looking at like, no, your granddad was just an average German, and all those things that you're saying, God forbid, about Fred Trump. that we're just like, no, he was a bad man and like, time or whatever, is like, no, those are the fundamental German characteristics. Like all he did was care about work, like he never showed any emotion or these type things. And it's like, well, of course he was German. That's the German characteristic. And I guess you can't say that anymore. So even Mary Trump, where she's basically like repenting on her grandfather being German. And I don't know if you wanted to talk about that or kind of like Neusner in the problem or even Shapiro, is you can't be a legendary rabbi unless you're ultra-Orthodox.
Right, because the more committed you are to facts and truth, the less you care about legends. So people like Neusner and Shapiro have their primary dedication to things that are factual. So Neusner said it is quite natural for a Jewish community to look upon professors in the field of Jewish learning and in the history of Judaism as allies in the struggle. They are widely expected to continue in the classroom the advocacy of Judaism, which begins in the synagogue schools and continues in the pulpit. However, neither such academic studies nor those responsible for pursuing them must be used for propaganda. It is not the responsibility of the historian of Judaism or of Hebrew to interest himself in the state of the soul of his students, whether Jewish or Gentile. So the scholar of Judaism, Jacob Neusner maintains, is by definition a critic, a role that necessarily removes him from the community. Were this not the case, Jewish studies would cease to be intellectually rigorous or responsible and would be little more than the extension of local Jewish organizations. When pretty much every other person engaged in the study of Jewish texts was focused solely on their particular text or set of texts, Jacob Neusner was singular because he insisted on looking at the big picture of what it meant intellectually, pedagogically, scientifically to study Judaism. By the time he claimed early retirement in 1990, he was all but isolated at Brown University, ostracized by former friends and colleagues, unwilling to train any more graduate students and contemplating a life beyond the academy. He began his career, as many professors do, writing out lectures and then standing awkwardly in front of a classroom and reading. Such a model may be designed to impress students with vast knowledge, but it often has the opposite effect of putting them to sleep. While Neusner would threaten to sue academic departments that did not hire his non-Jewish students for Jewish studies positions, he was opposed when the Jewish Theological Seminary was on the verge of offering a position to a non-Jew. So he opposed intermarriage, refused to attend the wedding of his niece when she married a non-Jew.
Yeah, and just see the
Unlike
changing
other
times.
scholars of Judaism, Neusner did not believe the task of Jewish studies was to teach Torah to the children of Israel. Neusner did not forbid his students from reading the work of his critics. He actively encouraged it. He made all of his students, whether Jewish or Gentile, attend an Orthodox Jewish service every week for at least a year to hear the entire Torah chanted. His reason for doing this was that if the student did not hear the Torah chanted, he would not be able to see the text as a living presence and thus would miss what it meant to be a scholar of the religion. So I had meals with an Orthodox rabbi in this community, and he was amazed at the level of Torah knowledge by Jacob Neusner's students, whether Jewish or not Jewish, even though they had this completely secular approach to the text. Okay, Dooovid, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Neusner is also a change in times, like the intermarriage and interfaith and these things that you were talking the 80s or the 60s or civil rights that would be even the conservative community has become much more progressive. And I mean, it's interesting. I like Neusner's scholarship, and it's just like I asked you about Shapiro and saying who is his target audience, and I mean, really, his target audience is probably just the handful of students that take these Judaic study classes and study his book. And like in some world, he might. And Neusner also has a very small target audience, and you could hear from the bio is that he is very unsuccessful at transferring his scholarship into power, and he seems to constantly have these failures where he's trying to control the situation and basically like, who the hell are you to control the situation? You're just a scholar. And from his bio, it just seems that constant thing over and over again where he like at the same time he covets the role of just a scholar who sits back and reads books, but then at the same time he thinks he has such authoritative knowledge where he's going to have opinions on how other people should operate and then get upset when they don't operate according to the way he operates. Like me and Luke were arguing with Gandalf, where we're just like, me and Luke don't really expect people to change or adapt their behavior off of what we say, is where Gandalf was all upset, that people aren't ordered and listening to him.
Thanks, Dooovid. Good points. Let me read some more notes of this excellent 2016 biography of Jacob Neusner, an important scholar in founding secular academic Jewish scholarship in the United States. Neusner read critically every book his students wrote before it was printed. He did not want his students to be criticized for making silly mistakes, which would then reflect badly on him. He trained his students for careers in religious studies as opposed to Jewish studies, provided them with the intellectual and conceptual wherewithal to talk to scholars of other religions. He provided them a language that would make them employable in departments of religious studies. Rather than use the rabbinic term sugya, for example, he would make them use the more familiar term pericope, meaning it's a self-contained section of text. Neusner's Jewish Studies program, unlike pretty much every other Jewish Studies program or department in the country, was staffed primarily by non-Jews. Neusner had a rogue graduate student, Richard E. Cohen. They had a falling out in 1987. Cohen accused Jacob Neusner of taking his fellowship check out of his mailbox with hoarding it, of inappropriate grading procedures, of blocking the publication of an article that he was preparing for one of Neusner's books, and of engaging in a campaign of defamation. Neusner, who it is worth noting had never had such a negative relationship with a graduate student, replied that Cohen was unstable. This went before the university, and it was Neusner who was sanctioned. And then there's a very funny story about a Jewish academic meeting here. Let me get my notes. So the event was to take place on a Monday from 7 to 9 p.m. At the beginning of the session where Neusner was going to preside, Neusner's former teacher, Morton Smith, walked stiffly and quickly to the first row, immediately facing the lectern. Behind him was a large shopping bag with 2 boxes inside. He sat upright through Neusner's comments and the first 2 responses. When questions were invited from the floor, his hand shot up. Recognizing him, W.D. Davies of Texas Christian University, the chair of the session, pointed to Smith, who stood and proceeded to the lectern. After a few rambling comments about the inaccuracies of Neusner's translation and not the books that were supposed to be under discussion, and the danger they posed to the future of the field, Professor Smith proceeded to open the boxes in his shopping bag and hand out copies of Saul Lieberman's devastating review of a Neusner book to the audience. Davies pleaded with Smith to desist until the end of the session. Smith ignored him and continued to pass out the negative reviews. Neusner was dumbfounded. Davies then asked Neusner if he would like to respond. With Smith still passing out the reviews, Neusner went to the lectern and said, "Things do not always turn out as planned. Professor Smith was my teacher, and I honor him. He has helped me in difficult times. I honor and respect his criticism. I'm always happy to hear it." He then sat down to subdued applause. While Smith finished handing out the Saul Lieberman review, the session subsequently ended without any further discussion. The event was, for Neusner, the lowest point in his academic career. To make matters worse, Herschel Shanks, the editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, published the ramblings of Smith, who also served on the editorial advisory board of the journal. By the time they found their way into print, Smith's largely extemporaneous ramblings had been transformed so that they no longer resembled the original claims. The Biblical Archaeology Review did not mention the contents of Neusner's lecture or the comments of his 2 respondents. So Shanks eventually published an apology in the next issue of Biblical Archaeology Review. So Jacob Neusner was constantly in conflict with his peers. And then this is what Neusner said. He published this article in the Brown University publication. Then it got republished in the Washington Post, and he was invited on the Today Show, all sorts of media. A commencement speech you will never hear. We, the faculty, take no pride in our educational achievements with you. We have prepared you for a world that does not exist, indeed that cannot exist. You have spent 4 years supposing that failure leaves no record. You have learned at Brown that when your work goes poorly, the painless solution is to drop out. But starting now in the world to which you go, failure marks you. Confronting difficulty by quitting leaves you changed. Outside Brown, quitters are no heroes. With us, You could argue about why your errors were not errors, why mediocre work really was excellent, why you can take pride in routine and slipshod presentation. Most of you, after all, can look back on honor grades for most of what you have done. So here, grades can have meant little in distinguishing the excellent from the ordinary, but tomorrow, in the world to which you go, you had best not defend errors but learn from them. You would be ill-advised to demand praise for what does not deserve it and abuse those who do not give it. For 4 years, we created an altogether forgiving world, in which whatever slight effort you gave was all that was demanded. When you did not keep appointments, we made new ones. When your work came in beyond the deadline, we pretended not to care. Worse still, when you were boring, we acted as if you were saying something important. When you were garrulous and talked to hear yourself talk, we listened as if it mattered. When you tossed on our desks writing upon which you had not labored, we read it and even responded as though you earned a response. When you were dull, we pretended you were smart. When you were predictable, unimaginative, and routine, we listened as if to new and wonderful things. When you demanded free lunch, we served it. And all this, why? Despite your fantasies, it was not even that we wanted to be liked by you. It was that we did not want to be bothered, and the easy way out was pretense, smiles, and easy bees. It is conventional to quote in addresses such as these. Let me quote someone you've never heard of, Professor Carter A. Daniel of Rutgers University. College has spoiled you by reading papers that don't deserve to be read, listening to comments that don't deserve a hearing, paying attention even to the lazy, ill-informed, and rude. We had to do it for the sake of education, but nobody will ever do it again. College has deprived you of adequate preparation for the next 50 years. It has failed you by being easy, free, forgiving, attentive, comfortable, interesting, unchallenging, and fun. Good luck tomorrow. This is why on this commencement day, we have nothing in which to take pride. Oh yes, there's one more thing. Try not to act toward your co-workers and bosses if you have acted toward us. I mean, when they do not give you what you want, but have not earned. Don't abuse them, insult them, or act out with them your parlous relationships with your parents. This too we have tolerated. It was not to be liked. Few professors actually care whether or not they are liked by peer-paralyzed adolescents. Fools so shallow as to imagine professors care not about education but about popularity. It was, again, to be rid of you. So go unlearn the lies we taught you to life. That's the end. Okay, Dooovid, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I would think of my own story, and maybe I'm like a half Jew, but like a Neusner type guy. Unfortunately, I'm like a high IQ guy. I got rejected by Harvard. Had I got into Harvard, and listening to Neusner, he's a pre-Bali Tshuva movement rabbi, and like Yair Lapid had his famous speech in Israel to the Orthodox community, where he just said, "You guys won." Everybody expected the Orthodox community to lose within mainstream Judaism, really for the last 100 years. And especially in Israel, when they first founded Israel, no one would have ever pictured that the Haredim would be part of the coalition governments, and so power and politics. And also, people didn't predict that people that are interested in Judaism in America would become Orthodox like me. And so, in Neusner's time, I probably wouldn't have existed because I got to Israel and, Or Samaic or whatever. But I saw that like Orthodox Judaism is more representational of Judaism. And, if I had went down a reform or conservative path, I would probably be protesting Israel right now. And I was, already 20 years ago, I was able to see that. So I just chose the path of orthodoxy. So I think from, like this perspective, like me and Luke, Neusner is decades ago where the situation of Israel wasn't as secure as it was, and the situation of Jews in America was majority along the assimilation path. But what was going to be best for the Jewish people was creating some sort of mass understanding of Goyim and Jews, like, your secular American Jew, Jewish Goy, and universal humanitarianism, and the Civil Rights Act, and these various things, like a Neusner talking with Cornel West, and these various things that I'm sure the majority of Jewish people decades ago thought would be important for the Jewish people. However, so people like Neusner and the academias and the big funders and the Jewish money put a lot of effort into Judaic studies, pushing this type movement of Shapiro, now, and, guys like Neusner don't even really exist anymore. You have guys like Shapiro who are like, open orthodoxy. But from me or Luke's perspective, you're like, no, we're going to go for orthodoxy, because if we're seriously interested in learning about Judaism, do you really want to go for a Judaic studies degree for something that's going to teach you something that's out of line with what the official rabbis in Israel say? And so it's going to be a hard sell. And also there's the decline of reform in conservatism. And it's like, it's no surprise that in most Judaic study programs, half of the students are goyim. And the few Jewish students that are into it usually go on to work for Jewish charities, Jewish organizations, Federation, ADL type things. Like they want to be the next Deborah Lipstadt, as where your average secular person who gets like Dooovid, who is interested in my Judaism, is much more likely to become a Baal Tshuva and look into Orthodox Judaism. And so I'm just listening to Luke and his stories, and I could see, from my own perspective as a history, even after high school, when I went to Israel, one of my mother's, colleagues said, don't send him to Israel, they'll brainwash him, he'll come back Orthodox. And that was already in the 90s, where this guy, as a proponent of secular Judaism and a fan of Neusner, was kind of warning my mother, the scene in Israel is, if your son's interested in Judaism and goes to Israel, he's going to come back Orthodox. There's no other option. And so it's interesting hearing Neusner and what he was trying to do, and then looking back at kind of failure. And I don't know if Luke would agree with that, saying from Neusner's perspective, you're just like Yair Lapid, his father, you wouldn't have predicted the Orthodox to win. And so he was designing the system for what he saw would be the future of Jewish scholarship. And then, in the 80s, Chabad and Israel turning to the right, the rise of Likud, all of a sudden there's no interest besides for a few goyim and a few people who work for Jewish organizations, and anyone who would have been interested in what Neusner had to teach is basically looking into orthodoxy.
Right. I don't know what Neusner said about the revival of orthodoxy, but he was not picking winners. His job was not as a partisan. His job, as he saw it, was to promote scholarship.
Well, I'm saying it didn't happen in his lifetime. The revival of orthodoxy maybe happened in the last 10 years of his lifetime. But I'm saying for the decades where Neusner was pumping out books, no one in the mainstream Jewish world would have predicted that orthodoxy would have a resurgence.
Well, I don't know.
Besides the Orthodox.
Yeah, I think people were starting to see it in the 1960s onward. So just by the explosion of, say, kosher eating establishments, even just kosher pizza shops, people are seeing it. Also, people sense the confidence of Orthodox Jews. So that's why it's been so important to non-Orthodox denominations. They want to be accepted as legitimate expressions of Judaism by Orthodox Jews. And Orthodox Jews, by definition of being Orthodox, they cannot give Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionist Jews that recognition that they are part of Judaism. From an Orthodox perspective, these are heretical streams.
But I made the point the Orthodox community had very little power in America closer to the war, and the power and wealth and self supporting of the Orthodox community has increased to a level where people like Dooovid could just switch Orthodox, as where historically the Orthodox, no Jew who could have got into Harvard in their right mind would have considered becoming Orthodox. It would have been what, you want to be dumb and poor? And that maybe in the 60s already starts switching. But yeah, I guess, I'm disagreeing with Luke on a historical narrative. And, in Israel also, Yair Lapid has his famous speech where you're just from the mainstream secular Zionist Israeli community, everyone was betting against the Orthodox. And so Neusner is part of this, whether Luke is right, historically, there was reasons already going back into the 60s earlier that you should have been betting on the Orthodoxy. And even in the mainstream Jewish world today of federations and mainstream Jewish funding networks, a lot of them are still anti-Orthodox. And their funding specifically is designed for things that take Orthodox Jews and make them more secular. Like Hillel houses on university campus originally had a mission statement that was designed to assimilate Orthodox Jews. But I was saying Neusner comes in where that was the groupthink among everybody. Like now, I'm sure Luke knows people, and I know people. They went to Harvard and they're Orthodox and they're Bali Tshuva. But like I'm just saying, in Neusner's time, I would have guessed in mainstream Judaism or even Israel, it would have just been unimaginable that anybody who could have competed on the highest level of Goyim would have even considered Orthodoxy.
Right. So prior to World War II, the Reform and conservative rabbis were confident that their movement represented the only sustainable future of Jewry. They had great assurance. They thought that only their movements were in accord with scholarship, essentially meaning that only their movements were true, and they saw Orthodox Judaism as dying out. But after World War II, you had the immigration of a lot of very serious Orthodox Jews to the United States and to England and to Australia, and that started the revival of Orthodox Judaism. And then by the 1960s, the high outmarriage rates in Reform and conservative Jews and the growing confidence of the Orthodox Jews. And so since the 1960s, Orthodox Jews have no doubt that they will continue for hundreds and hundreds of years. And now it's the Reform and conservative intellectuals and clergy who lack the confidence, and the Orthodox overwhelmingly have the confidence, because not only they have growing numbers, but they have a sustainable way of living. So when I initially converted to Judaism, it was through Reform Judaism in 1993. And I was just eager to participate in every form of Judaism possible. I would go to Reform temples, I'd go to conservative synagogues, I'd go to Orthodox shuls. But within a few years, I saw that Orthodox shuls were the only ones that were filled with young people, that were filled with life, that were filled with kids. That Reform temples on Friday nights would be almost all women. And so I saw that only Orthodox Judaism, from a sociological perspective, was capable of sustaining itself generation after generation. Okay, I'm going to wind up the show for today. So, Dooovid, any final words? Your turn.
Yeah. So tomorrow I have a call at 7 about the possibility of the future of the chess club in Detroit. So if you want to talk, I'll be around in the afternoon, but I'll have to leave at 7. And I appreciate these because, like, honestly, I'm like, unlike Luke, I'm not a blogger, so I'm just a guy who largely reads books and thinks about these things. And in reality, in New York, I had a handful of people I talked about this stuff with, like this Rabbi Hirsch. Like, I paid $150 for the complete writings of Rabbi Hirsch when I was making $12 an hour.
Wow.
And no one cared about Rabbi Hirsch then. Like, I knew from my own perspective that eventually one day I would have to leave the confines of the Orthodox world. And Rabbi Hirsch, I'll finish with the story of the Munkacher Rebbe, who I went with Rabbi Jungreis of Nicholsburg. He's a famous rabbi in Borough Park. Probably even people in LA have heard of him because he's very friendly to all Jews. He writes songs. And he took me to the Munkacher Rebbe, who, maybe, Luke, we could talk more about this. He's interesting because Munkach was extremely anti-Zionist. And then the Rebbe's, like, after the war, ends up in South America almost becoming irreligious, and then becomes a Zionist, and then goes to a Litvish yeshiva where they gets recruited to reestablish becoming Rebbe. So this Rabbi Jungreis, who I was serving as his, like, right-hand man, his gabbai, at certain times, he took me to the Munkacher Rebbe. You heard of these Nicholsburg, Jungreis,
Yes.
Munkach? Okay, so the Munkacher Rebbe tells Rabbi Jungreis just wants a bracha from the Rebbe. And so the Munkacher Rebbe tells this story about Rabbi Jungreis's ancestor. And he says, because this Rabbi Jungreis is a very famous prayer leader. He writes his own songs. He's like, yes, your great-grandfather was also a very famous prayer leader. And he once came to my grandfather, the Minches Eluzar, the famous Munkacher Rebbe in Hungary that had huge amounts of Hasidim. And Nicholsburg, Rabbi Hirsch had served as like a junior rabbi in Nicholsburg, which was a Hasidic area in Hungary before he went back to Germany. So among the Orthodox rabbis, of people who had their opinions, Rabbi Hirsch was basically the only one that was respected among the ultra-Orthodox. So this Munkacher Rebbe says that this famous Nicholsburg Rebbe asked them about studying Rabbi Hirsch's books. And the Minchas Eliezer, as told through the current Mumkacher Rebbe when I went to see him, says there will be, I mean, he said in Yiddish, but he said, there will be reward in the world to come for people who study the teachings of Rabbi Hirsch, but it'll be a cold reward. And that's probably like a Hasidic interpretation of modern Orthodoxy. Like in Yiddish, they say it's a cult of Judaism. You know, they're not so friendly. They're not so Heimish. They're not going to take you into their house. So within that realm of ultra Orthodoxy, like Dooovid knew my you know, like I'm not going to last long in the Orthodox world, and I'm going to need Rabbi Hirsch. But you know, based on that, like, you know, even the Mumkacher Rebbe said the teachings of Rabbi Hirsch will get you to heaven. It's just going to be a not as friendly heaven as opposed to more mainstream Orthodoxy.
Okay, thanks, Dooovid. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so that's going to do it for today. Take you out with a
ground
song.
And welcome the Qantas Choir.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the MCG the Australian Girls Choir, the National Boys Choir of Australia, and the Gondwana National Indigenous Children's Choir, featuring Ty Assant from the Torres Strait Islands.
Okay, thanks for